When Shaquille O'Neal called his business manager on a Monday morning in October 2024 and said 7 words, "Sell the restaurants, all of them," she spilled her coffee across a $14,000 desk and thought he had lost his mind. All of them. The 155 Five Guys locations, the 9 Papa John's, the 17 Auntie Anne's, the Krispy Kreme shops, even Big Chicken. The restaurant he built from nothing, the one with his face on the sign and his mother's recipes on the menu. $180 million, gone, overnight, just like that. His business manager said, "Shaq, you can't just..." He said, "I'm not asking, I'm telling. Start the calls." She asked him why, and what he said next made no sense. Because the man he was talking about had been dead for 11 years. "My father told me to." His stepfather, Philip Arthur Harrison, the Army sergeant who raised him, the man Shaq calls his real dad, died on September 22, 2013. He'd been gone for over a decade. So how exactly does a dead man tell you to sell 155 restaurants? With a letter written on March 3, 1994. 30 years ago, sealed in a white envelope, placed inside a military footlocker, locked with a combination that was Shaq's birthday, and hidden at the bottom, beneath a folded American flag, beneath a Bible with Philip's name on it, beneath a Purple Heart medal that nobody in the family even knew existed. Shaq's mother found it 6 days earlier in a storage unit in Newark, New Jersey. A storage unit the family had been paying $175 a month for 35 years. She opened the footlocker. She found 2 envelopes. The first one said, "For Shaquille." The second one had a name on it that Shaq hadn't spoken out loud in 15 years. A name that wasn't Harrison. The name of the man who left before Shaq could walk. The name of his biological father. And carved into the bottom of that footlocker. Not written, carved, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were 3 words that would explain everything. 3 words that would connect a barber shop that burned in the Newark riots of 1967, to a room above a hardware store in rural Virginia, to a chicken processing plant, to 47 letters that were written to Shaq over the course of years and never sent. 47 letters from a father who loved his son and couldn't face him. 47 letters that sat on a windowsill until the man who wrote them died alone and the landlord threw them in the trash. But I haven't told you what those 3 words were yet. I haven't told you what Philip confessed in that letter. I haven't told you about the secret trip he made in 1984 that he hid from everyone, including Shaq's mother, for the rest of his life. I haven't told you what he found in that room in Virginia, something so heavy he locked it in a box for 30 years instead of saying it out loud. And I definitely haven't told you what Shaq built with the $168 million after he sold every single restaurant. What had he built instead? And why it made a 37-year-old unemployed electrician sitting across from his 6-year-old son in a food bank start crying over a plate of scrambled eggs. You need to stay for this one. The whole thing. Because this is not a story about restaurants. This is not a story about money. This is a story about hunger. A kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. It starts with a phone call on a Monday morning. October 14, 2024. A gray Monday. The kind of Monday that Atlanta makes in mid-October when the summer is finally over and the sky sits on the city like a lid. And Shaquille O'Neal is standing in his kitchen, holding a phone, about to say 7 words that will end an empire and build something better. On the morning of October 14, 2024. A gray Monday. The kind of Monday that Atlanta produces in mid-October when the summer's arrogance has finally broken and the sky settles into a flat, pewter overcast that sits on the city like a lid. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal made a phone call that destroyed a business empire worth $180 million. He made it from his penthouse in Buckhead. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Peachtree Road, the same Peachtree Road that serves as Atlanta's spine. Running north from downtown through Midtown and into the affluent oak-canopied neighborhoods where old Southern money and new entertainment money coexist in a state of mutual tolerance. The penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows. It had a view that stretched east to Stone Mountain and south to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. where planes took off every 90 seconds, carrying people to places that were smaller than this apartment. The apartment was 7,800 square feet. It had been designed by an architectural firm in Miami that specialized in what they called scale-sensitive luxury, which was their polite, professional way of saying building homes for people whose bodies don't fit in normal homes. Every doorway was 8 feet tall instead of the standard 6'8". Every countertop was raised 4 inches. Every shower head was mounted at 7 feet 6 inches. The furniture was custom. Reinforced frames, widened seats, the kind of structural engineering that most people associate with bridges and stadiums applied instead to sofas and dining chairs. Shaq was standing in the kitchen when he made the call. He was always standing when he did important things. Something about verticality. Something about occupying his full height. All 7 feet, 1 inch of it, all 325 pounds distributed across a frame that had been engineered by genetics and disciplined by a U.S. Army sergeant into the most dominant physical force the NBA had ever witnessed. Standing was how Shaq prepared. Standing was how Shaq decided. Standing was how Philip Arthur Harrison had taught him to face things that mattered. On your feet, shoulders square, eyes forward, the posture of a man who has already made up his mind and is now simply executing. He stood in the kitchen at 8:13 a.m. and he called Renata Solano Vickers. Renata was 47 years old. She was the founder and managing partner of Vickers Capital Advisory, a boutique financial management firm on Peachtree Road, 3 miles south of Shaq's penthouse, in a converted brownstone with exposed brick walls and a conference room table that cost $14,000, and that Renata had purchased specifically because it was the exact shade of mahogany that communicated to every athlete and entertainer who sat at it that the person managing their money understood the difference between looking wealthy and being wealthy. Renata was good at her job in the way that certain people are good at their jobs, not with passion, not with enthusiasm, but with the cold, relentless, almost mechanical precision of someone who views money the way an engineer views a bridge, as a structural problem to be solved. She had managed the financial affairs of professional athletes for 19 years. She had handled NFL contracts and NBA endorsements and the particular kind of wealth management that celebrity requires. The management not just of money, but of the ecosystems that money creates. The entourages, the obligations, the family members who emerge from decades of silence when the first contract is signed. The business opportunities that sound exciting and are financially catastrophic. The tax implications of owning property in 7 states. The prenuptial agreements, the postnuptial agreements, the agreements about the agreements. She had handled crises, tax audits that lasted 3 years, divorce settlements that required the diplomatic skill of a UN negotiator, a situation involving a professional golfer, a yacht registered in the Cayman Islands, and a series of wire transfers that she was legally and contractually, and, if she was being honest, morally prohibited from discussing with anyone, ever, for the rest of her natural life. She had managed Shaq's business portfolio for 6 years. In that time, she had watched him build something that most athletes never build, not just wealth, but an empire. A diversified, revenue-generating, strategically positioned empire that included real estate, equity stakes in technology companies, endorsement deals with brands ranging from Icy Hot to the General Insurance to Papa John's, and at its center, its crown jewel, its most visible and publicly discussed component, the restaurants. The restaurants. 155 Five Guys franchise locations spread across Georgia, Texas, Florida, and California, each location generating average annual revenue of approximately $1.2 million. Total portfolio revenue, roughly $186 million per year. Net profit margin after franchise fees, labor, food costs, and overhead, approximately 8 to 12%, depending on location. The Five Guys portfolio alone was, by Renata's conservative estimate, worth somewhere between $90 and $110 million. 9 Papa John's locations. Acquired beginning in 2019 when Shaq joined the company's board of directors and became both a brand ambassador and a franchise operator. A dual role that gave him a seat at the corporate table and an ownership stake in the ovens. The Papa John's locations were concentrated in Atlanta, close to home, close to oversight, generating a combined annual revenue of approximately $8 million. 17 Auntie Anne's pretzel shops. A less glamorous holding. Soft pretzels don't generate headlines the way pizza and burgers do, but steady, reliable. The kind of franchise that Renata loved. Low overhead, high foot traffic, margins that didn't fluctuate with consumer trends, because Americans have never and will never stop eating soft pretzels at airports and shopping malls. Krispy Kreme locations. A smaller stake, but strategically valuable. The brand recognition alone was worth the investment. And Big Chicken. Big Chicken was different from the others. The Five Guys locations and the Papa John's and the Auntie Anne's, those were franchise operations. Shaq didn't create those brands. He bought into them. He attached his name and his capital and his marketing power to brands that already existed, brands that had already proven their business models, brands whose success was a function of systems and supply chains and the replicable, scalable, fundamentally impersonal machinery of franchise capitalism. Big Chicken was personal. Shaq created it from nothing. From the specific, idiosyncratic, deeply held belief that a chicken sandwich should be enormous, comically, aggressively, Shaq-sized enormous, and that it should be made with recipes inspired by his mother Lucille's cooking, and that the restaurant should feel like walking into Shaq's house, which meant the decor included sneakers, mounted on walls and basketball memorabilia in display cases, and a general atmosphere of joyful excess that reflected Shaq's personality the way a mirror reflects a face. The first Big Chicken opened at the intersection of South Las Vegas Boulevard and Flamingo Road in Las Vegas in October 2018. The line on opening day wrapped around the building. The signature sandwich, the Shack Attack, a fried chicken breast with a spicy slaw and pickles on a brioche bun that was roughly the size of a dinner plate, sold 1,200 units in the first 6 hours. Food critics called it ridiculous and surprisingly excellent, and exactly what you'd expect from a restaurant owned by a 7-foot man. Reviews that were, in the restaurant industry, as close to a perfect score as a chicken sandwich can get. Big Chicken expanded. Las Vegas, Atlanta, Phoenix, Los Angeles. The brand was growing. The brand was Shaq's. The brand was named after him and shaped by him and infused with his sensibility and his humor and his mother's recipes and his belief. Sincere, unironic, genuinely held that food should be big because life should be big. This was the empire that Renata Solano Vickers managed. This was the empire that Shaq dismantled with 7 words at 8:13 on a Monday morning. Sell the restaurants. All of them. Renata was sitting at the $14,000 mahogany table. She was drinking coffee, black, no sugar, from a ceramic mug that her daughter, Paloma, had made at a pottery class when she was 9, and that was lopsided and badly glazed, and was, by a significant margin, the most valuable object on Renata's desk, because value is not a function of craftsmanship, it is a function of love. The coffee was in her hand when Shaq said the 7 words. The coffee was on the mahogany table, spreading in a dark, irregular pool across the $14,000 surface, soaking into a stack of quarterly reports, reaching the edge and beginning to drip onto the hardwood floor. Approximately 1.5 seconds later, Shaq, Renata said. She said his name the way a doctor says a patient's name when the patient has just said something that requires immediate clinical attention. Not alarmed, not panicked, calibrated. The voice of a professional who has heard extraordinary things before and whose first instinct is not to react but to assess. That's $180 million in assets. You can't just, I'm not asking, Renata, I'm telling. Start the calls. His voice was flat, not emotional. Flat in the way that a lake is flat when there is no wind. A stillness that is not calm, but rather the absence of visible turbulence, beneath which currents are moving in directions that the surface doesn't reveal. Renata recognized that voice. She had heard it 3 times in 6 years. Once when Shaq decided to sell a real estate holding in Miami that she had strongly advised him to keep. Once when he committed $2 million to a charity in Newark that she had told him was financially unnecessary. And once, the time that haunted her, when he called her on September 20, 2013, from a hospital in Orlando and said, in a voice so flat it was almost inaudible, "Philip's gone. Handle the arrangements." That voice. The voice that meant the decision was made. The voice that meant the conversation they were having was not a negotiation. It was a notification. "Can you at least tell me why?" Renata asked. Silence. Not the silence of a man thinking. Not the silence of a man hesitating. The silence of a man standing in a kitchen in a penthouse in Buckhead, Georgia, looking out at a city through floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a phone in a hand large enough to palm a basketball and crush a watermelon. A hand that was, at this moment, gripping the phone so tightly that the case was flexing, and trying to find words for something that had been living inside him for 6 days. Something he had read in a storage unit in Newark, New Jersey, under fluorescent lights, standing on a concrete floor, holding a piece of paper that had been sealed for 30 years and that had blown a hole in the center of his life so large that he could feel the wind passing through it. "My father told me to," Shaq said. Renata blinked. The blink was involuntary, a neurological response to information that the brain has received, but that the conscious mind has not yet agreed to process. She knew Philip Arthur Harrison. Not well. She had met him only twice, once at a business dinner in 2012 and once at the funeral in 2013. But she knew what he meant to Shaq. She knew that Philip was the foundation. Not the fame, not the championships, not the money. Philip, the man who adopted a 2-year-old boy named Shaquille and raised him with a discipline so intense it bordered on ferocious, and a love so deep it was almost invisible, buried beneath layers of military protocol and masculine stoicism and the particular emotional architecture of a black man born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in 1951, who was taught by his father, by his community, by the United States of America, that tenderness was a vulnerability and vulnerability was a death sentence. Philip Harrison died on September 22, 2013. Renata knew the date the way she knew all financially relevant dates, precisely, permanently, filed in the meticulous internal calendar that she maintained alongside the external one. "Shaq," Renata said carefully. The carefully was audible. A slight softening of her voice, a reduction in the professional frequency that she normally operated on, a shift toward something more human. "Philip has been gone for 11 years. "I know," Shaq said. "Then how?" "I just got his letter." The word landed. Letter. A simple word, 6 letters, 1 syllable. The kind of word that children learn to spell in 1st grade, that appears on vocabulary lists between left and light, that carries no inherent weight, no gravitational pull, no particular danger. Unless the letter was written 30 years ago by a dead man, and sealed in an envelope and locked in a military footlocker and hidden, deliberately, consciously, with purpose. At the bottom of a container that also held a folded American flag, and a King James Bible, and a Purple Heart medal that nobody in the family knew existed. Unless the letter was addressed in the precise angular handwriting of a man who formed every word as if it were standing at inspection. To a son who was 21 years old when it was written and 52 years old when it was read. Unless the letter contained a confession. Not a small confession. Not the kind of confession that adjusts the way you think about someone by a few degrees. "Oh, I didn't know he felt that way," and then recedes into the archive of things learned and filed. A big confession. The kind that reorganizes the entire structure of a life. The kind that takes everything you believed about a person, about a father, about a relationship, about the reasons behind 20 years of hardness and silence and the specific brand of love that looks, from the outside, almost exactly like its opposite, and dismantles it. Board by board, nail by nail, until you're standing in the empty space where the structure used to be, and you can see for the first time the ground it was built on. "Renata," Shaq said, "start the calls. I'll explain everything. But not today. When I understand it myself." The call ended. Renata sat at her desk. The coffee had reached the floor. The quarterly reports were ruined. Paloma's lopsided mug was empty, resting on its side in the middle of the mahogany lake. A small, imperfect, beloved object, surrounded by the evidence of a $180 million decision that had just been made in less than 2 minutes. She picked up the mug, set it upright, looked at it for a long moment, at the uneven rim, at the glaze that pooled too thick on one side and too thin on the other, at the tiny fingerprints baked into the surface by a 9-year-old who had pressed too hard and didn't know that pressing too hard would leave permanent marks. Except Paloma did know. She had told Renata when she brought the mug home from pottery class. "I pressed hard on purpose, so you'd always know it was me." Fingerprints, pressed deliberately, into something that was being made. Renata didn't know it yet, but that was exactly what Philip Harrison's letter was about. She started making calls. The first call went to a mergers and acquisition attorney named Griffin Sow at a firm in Midtown. Griffin was 51. He had handled franchise sales for national brands for 23 years. He had never received a call asking him to liquidate 155 Five Guys locations simultaneously. He asked Renata to repeat herself. She repeated herself. He asked her if this was a joke. She said it was not a joke. He asked her why. She said she didn't know. "You don't know?" Griffin said. "The client says his father told him to. His father is deceased. I'm aware." Silence. A different kind than the one on Shaq's call. This was the silence of a lawyer's brain recalibrating, running a rapid diagnostic on the legal, financial, and possibly psychiatric implications of a client liquidating $180 million in assets based on instructions from a dead man. "I'll need a formal letter of intent," Griffin said. "You'll have it by end of day." "Renata, yes. Is he okay?" Renata looked at the coffee on her desk, at the ruined reports, at Paloma's mug, standing upright now, empty, a small container that had once held something warm. "I don't know," she said. "I think he might be more okay than he's ever been, or less. I can't tell yet." She couldn't tell because she hadn't read the letter. She didn't know about the footlocker. She didn't know about the storage unit on Hawthorne Avenue. She didn't know about the second envelope, the one that wasn't addressed to Shaq, the one that was addressed to a name she had never heard Shaq speak, a name that had been absent from his life for 52 years, and that was, as of 6 days ago, more present than it had ever been. She didn't know about Joseph Tony. She didn't know about Emporia, Virginia. She didn't know about the room above the hardware store. She didn't know about the 47 unsent letters on a windowsill. She didn't know about the hunger, but she would. Everyone would. Because the phone call that Shaq made at 8:13 on a Monday morning, the 7 words that spilled the coffee and ended the empire and set in motion the largest franchise liquidation in the history of American celebrity business, was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. A story that started 30 years earlier, in the handwriting of a dead man, on 6 sides of a legal pad, sealed in an envelope that said "for Shaquille" in letters that stood at attention. A story about 2 fathers, one who stayed, one who left. A story about why the one who stayed drove 5 hours to find the one who left, and what he found in a room above a hardware store in rural Virginia, and why he never told anyone, and why he wrote it down, and why he locked it in a footlocker with a combination that was his son's birthday. Tho 306, March 6. And why the truth inside that footlocker was heavy enough to collapse a $180 million empire and build something entirely different in its place. But the story begins before the letter, before the footlocker, before the phone call and the coffee and the mahogany desk. The story begins with the footlocker itself. Olive drab, stenciled, locked for 30 years in a storage unit on Hawthorne Avenue in Newark, New Jersey, and with a 73-year-old woman in a blue cardigan who drove there alone on an October afternoon because some boxes need to be opened by the hands that packed them. Lucille O'Neill drove a 2019 Cadillac XT5, midnight blue, leather interior. Heated seats that she kept on even in September because Lucille O'Neill was 73 years old and her bones had opinions about temperature that she had stopped arguing with sometime around her 65th birthday. The Cadillac was a gift from Shaq, Christmas 2019. He had wanted to buy her a Rolls-Royce. Lucille had said no. Lucille had said a Rolls-Royce was for people who wanted other people to look at them. And she was not that kind of person. And she had never been that kind of person. And she wasn't going to start being that kind of person at 68. just because her son had more money than God and less sense than a goat when it came to spending it. She said a Cadillac was fine. A Cadillac was American. A Cadillac was what women in her family drove when they could afford to drive anything. And since most of the women in her family had spent most of their lives unable to afford anything, a Cadillac was not just a car. It was an arrival, a destination reached. A sentence that began with someday and ended with leather seats and heated everything. Shaq bought the Cadillac. He also, without telling Lucille, had it fitted with a custom sound system, upgraded brakes, and a small engraved plaque on the dashboard that read, "For Mom, who drove me everywhere before I could drive myself, Shaquille." Lucille didn't discover the plaque for 3 weeks because she didn't look at dashboards. She looked at roads. When she found it, she sat in the driveway of her house in Orlando for 10 minutes, running her thumb over the engraving, and then she went inside and called Shaq and said, "The plaque is very nice. The sound system is too loud. Turn it down next time." That was Lucille. Gratitude expressed through critique. Love delivered in the packaging of complaint. The emotional language of a woman who had spent her entire life being strong because the alternative was being crushed, and who had internalized strength so completely that it had become indistinguishable from who she was. A load-bearing wall that had been load-bearing for so long it had forgotten it was also allowed to be a window. On October 8, 2024, Lucille drove the Cadillac from her home in Orlando, Florida, to Newark, New Jersey. 12 hours. She could have flown. Shaq would have chartered a plane. He would have chartered the entire airline if she'd asked. Because Shaq's relationship with his mother operated on a simple principle. Whatever she wants, immediately, no questions. But Lucille didn't want a plane. She wanted the drive. She wanted the 12 hours of highway between Orlando and Newark. The long, flat stretch of I-95 through Georgia and the Carolinas. The gradual urbanization of Virginia. The industrial compression of the Northeast Corridor. The bridges and tunnels and toll plazas that marked the transition from the south she had adopted to the north she had left. She wanted the time. Because the drive was not just a drive, it was a pilgrimage. A return to the place where her life with Philip Harrison had been assembled. Piece by piece, base by base, box by box, and where the material evidence of that life had been sitting in a storage unit for 35 years, accumulating dust and silence, and the particular weight that objects acquire when they've been left alone for a long time. The weight of waiting, the weight of patience, the weight of things that have been packed and sealed and stored and forgotten by everyone, except the things themselves, which remember everything because they have nothing else to do. The storage facility was called Easy Store. It occupied a one-story cinder block building on Hawthorne Avenue in Newark's South Ward. The same neighborhood where Shaq had spent portions of his childhood, the same blocks where he had walked to school at too tall heights and dodged attention that was sometimes friendly and sometimes not. The building was painted beige, the sign was red, the parking lot had 4 spaces. The office was manned by a man named Gideon Padilla, who was 61 years old, who had managed the facility since 2003, and who remembered Lucille, not because she was Shaq's mother. Gideon didn't know that. He remembered her because she paid on time. Every month. 35 years, not once late, not once short. A check. Always a check. Never online, never automatic draft. Because Lucille believed in writing checks the way she believed in handwritten thank you notes and ironed tablecloths, and attending church in shoes that were polished. A check for $175, written in blue ink, in handwriting that was neat and round and deliberate, mailed from whatever address the family was living at. Orlando for the last 2 decades, but before that, addresses in Georgia and New Jersey and Germany. Addresses that moved every few years the way military families move, like migratory birds following orders instead of seasons. Mrs. Harrison, Gideon said when she walked in. He still called her Mrs. Harrison. She had never corrected him. She had been Mrs. Harrison for 38 years. She would be Mrs. Harrison until she wasn't alive anymore, and possibly after that, depending on what the afterlife's policy on names turned out to be. "Gideon," she said, "I'm here to clean out the unit." "The whole thing?" The whole thing. Gideon gave her the key, a small brass key on a ring with a plastic tag labeled 14C. Unit 14C, 10 feet by $1575 a month, $73,750 over 35 years. A sum that, when Lucille calculated it, which she did in the Cadillac, somewhere on I-95 between Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia. Because Lucille's mind worked on arithmetic problems during long drives the way other people's minds worked on song lyrics, made her close her eyes briefly and think about what else $73,500 could have bought over 3.5 decades. But it didn't matter. The money was spent, the unit was full, and today was the day it would be emptied. She had come alone. Shaq had offered to send people, a crew, movers, organizers, the kind of professional team that celebrities deploy for tasks like this. Efficient, discreet, insured against damage. Trained to handle personal effects with the mechanical care of people who are paid to be careful, rather than motivated by love. Lucille said no. She said it the way she said most things. Briefly, without explanation, in a tone that communicated finality, the way a period communicates the end of a sentence. No, one syllable, complete. But the reason behind the no was not brief. The reason was deep and complicated and had to do with something that Lucille understood instinctively and that she could not have articulated if asked, because some truths live below the level of language, in the basement of the self where instinct and memory share a room. These boxes were hers. Not legally, not financially, not in the way that property is hers according to a lease agreement or a storage contract. They were hers the way a wound is yours. Because you're the one who received it. Because you're the one who felt it. Because the contents of these boxes, the uniforms, the photographs, the children's drawings, the tax returns, the Christmas ornaments wrapped in newspaper from 1987, the Bible with Philip's name on it, the report cards, the birthday cards, the handwritten grocery lists, the whole pressed and folded and mothballed residue of a life, spent moving from place to place in service to a country that had asked her husband to serve, and that she had served alongside him, unpaid, unranked, unrecognized, carrying the same boxes to the same kinds of houses on the same kinds of bases. These contents were the physical evidence of her life, and physical evidence should be handled by the hands that created it. She had packed these boxes. She would unpack them, alone. She arrived at Easy Store at 2:15 p.m. She parked the Cadillac. She took the key from Gideon. She walked down the corridor, concrete floor, metal doors, the smell of dust and cardboard, and the faint chemical ghost of mouse poison, to Unit 14C. She unlocked the door, rolled it up. The metal clattered and clanged on its tracks, the industrial sound of a door that had not been opened in. She tried to remember, at least 4 years. Maybe 5. The last time she'd come was to retrieve a box of photographs for Shaq's 50th birthday celebration in 2022. Before that, she couldn't remember. The unit was full. Not chaotically full, not hoarder full, military full, which is a different thing entirely. Military full means organized. It means labeled. It means stacked with the precise load-optimized geometry that the U.S. Army teaches its enlisted personnel during their first week of basic training, and that stays with them for the rest of their lives, informing not just how they pack boxes, but how they organize their minds, their relationships, their entire approach to the problem of being alive. Everything in its place, every place accountable, nothing wasted, nothing loose. The boxes were stacked 3 high along the back wall, olive drab and brown and white, labeled in Sharpie. Lucille's handwriting on most of them, Philip's on a few. Kitchen, Germany. Kids, school papers. Christmas. Philip, dress uniforms, Shaq trophies, each label a time capsule. Each box a room in a house that no longer existed, disassembled and compressed and stored and waiting. Lucille worked methodically. She started with the boxes nearest the door, the most recently stored, the most recently relevant. Tax documents from the 2000s. Old electronics, a VCR, a cassette player, a portable CD player that had been state-of-the-art in 1998 and was now a museum piece. Clothing that nobody would wear again, but that Lucille had not been able to throw away because throwing away a dead man's shirts felt like throwing away a dead man. And she was not ready for that. She would never be ready for that. Readiness was not the point. The point was doing it anyway. By 4 p.m., she had processed 14 boxes, sorted, organized, the keep pile, the donate pile, the discard pile. 3 categories. Every item assessed and assigned in under 10 seconds, the speed of a woman who had moved households 9 times in 28 years, and who knew, with the efficiency of long practice, which objects were anchors and which were ballast. At 4:17 p.m., she reached the back wall, the footlocker. It was sitting on the floor, in the corner, behind a stack of boxes labeled Philip, Personal, Olive Drab, Standard Issue. The kind the Army provides to every enlisted soldier for the storage of personal items. A container roughly 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, 18 inches deep, made of wood and canvas and metal fittings, designed to hold whatever a soldier considers essential and to survive whatever conditions the soldier is subjected to. Heat, cold, humidity, transport, deployment, 30 years in a storage unit in Newark. The footlocker had Philip's name stenciled on the top, white paint on olive drab. The military font, block letters, all capitals, no serifs, the typographic equivalent of standing at attention. Harrison, P.A., SSG Staff Sergeant. The rank Philip had held when he retired from the Army in 1997 after 28 years of service. E6, the 6th of 9 enlisted ranks. Not the highest, not the lowest, the middle. The sturdy middle, the rank that does the actual work of the Army. The rank that trains the soldiers and maintains the equipment, and executes the orders, and holds the whole thing together, while the officers above them make decisions, and the privates below them learn how to follow. Philip Harrison was a middleman, a holder, a man who occupied the space between things and kept them from falling apart. Below the name, his service number. Below the service number, nothing. Just olive drab, just canvas and wood and the years. The footlocker was locked. A combination padlock, brass, but no longer brass-colored. 30 years of storage air had oxidized the surface to a dark, mottled brown-black. The color of old pennies. The color of things that have been waiting. The lock was cold when Lucille touched it. Storage unit cold. The cold of a space that is not heated and not cooled and not lived in. A liminal temperature, neither warm nor frozen. The thermal equivalent of holding your breath. Lucille knew the combination. She had always known it, not because Philip told her. Philip didn't volunteer information. Information, in Philip Harrison's world, was distributed on a need-to-know basis. And Philip was the sole arbiter of who needed to know what. But Lucille had watched him open the footlocker once, years ago. 1996, maybe 1997. She couldn't remember the exact year, only the image. Philip at the kitchen table, the footlocker in front of him, his hands on the lock, his fingers turning the dial. She had watched his fingers from across the room, not spying, observing. The way a wife observes a husband, not with suspicion but with the ambient, continuous, barely conscious attention that decades of cohabitation produce. You learn a person's hands. You learn their patterns. You learn the micro-movements that their fingers make without thinking. The way they button a shirt. The way they hold a pen. The way they turn a combination locked to 4 numbers that their muscle memory knows even when their conscious mind is elsewhere. 0306, March 6, Shaq's birthday. Lucille had seen the numbers, had filed them, had carried them in her memory for nearly 30 years without ever using them, without ever needing to, without ever having a reason to open the footlocker, because the footlocker was Philip's. It was personal. It was the one container in their nomadic, military, perpetually disassembled and reassembled life that belonged solely to him. The one space that was not shared. The one box that Lucille did not pack, did not unpack, and did not organize and did not label. Because even in a marriage as close as theirs, and it was close, closer than most, forged in the particular intimacy of military life, where every 3 years you lose your friends, and your neighbors, and your grocery store, and the route you drive to work, and the only constant. The only thing that survives the relocation is the person sleeping next to you. Even in that marriage, there were boundaries. The footlocker was a boundary, and now Philip was gone. 11 years gone. And the footlocker was still here, still locked, still sitting in Unit 14C at Easy Store on Hawthorne Avenue, still holding whatever Philip had considered personal enough to lock away from the world and from his wife and from his son and from time itself. Lucille knelt. Her knees protested, the quiet, grinding protest of joints that have spent 73 years bearing weight, and that would appreciate very much if the weight could be reduced or at least distributed more evenly. She ignored her knees. She had been ignoring them for years. Knees were not in charge, Lucille was in charge. She turned the dial. The lock clicked open. The sound was small, a metallic snap, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic on Hawthorne Avenue. But the sound was also enormous. Because some sounds are measured not by their volume but by their consequence. A trigger being pulled is a quiet sound. A door being unlocked is a quiet sound. A heart stopping is the quietest sound in the world. The lock opened. Lucille removed it, set it on the concrete floor beside her knee, lifted the lid of the footlocker. The hinges groaned. The low, arthritic complaint of metal that has not moved in 30 years and has become comfortable with its position and does not want to change. The lid rose slowly. Lucille held it, looked inside. The first thing she saw was the flag, an American flag, folded into the traditional triangle, 13 folds, each one prescribed by military protocol, each one carrying a symbolic meaning that ranges from the secular. The first fold represents life, to the sacred. The 12th fold represents eternity. The flag was pristine. The fabric was bright. It had been stored in the dark, away from light, away from the slow bleaching erosion that sunlight performs on fabric over decades. It looked new. It looked like it had been folded yesterday. Lucille lifted the flag, held it against her chest. Not unfolding it, you don't unfold a military flag casually the way you'd unfold a blanket. You hold it. You acknowledge it. You feel the weight of it, the physical weight, which is slight, and the other weight, which is not. Beneath the flag was a Bible. King James Version, leather-bound, black. Philip's name embossed in gold on the lower right corner of the front cover. Philip A. Harrison. The leather was cracked at the spine from use. Philip read the Bible nightly, a habit he maintained from his early 20s until the day he died, not out of religious fervor but out of discipline. The Bible was, for Philip, another form of regulation, a manual, a set of instructions for how to conduct a life. Lucille opened the Bible. On the inside front cover in Philip's handwriting was a list of dates, family dates, births, marriages, deaths, the record that certain men keep in their Bibles, the genealogy of a family inscribed in the book that begins with the genealogy of humanity. Shaq's birthday, March 6, 1972, their wedding, June 14, 1975, the births of their other children, the deaths of parents and grandparents. The last entry was in a different ink, newer, darker, written at a different time than the others. I was hard because I was afraid. Lucille read the line, read it again, ran her thumb over the ink. She knew Philip had been hard. She didn't need a Bible inscription to tell her that. She had lived it. She had watched it. She had intervened. Sometimes. When Philip's discipline crossed the line from instructive to excessive, when the push-ups he assigned Shaq as punishment became too many, when the inspections of Shaq's room became too exacting, when the silence that Philip deployed as a form of disapproval lasted too long and began to harden into something that resembled not discipline but rejection. She had intervened, and Philip had listened, sometimes. And the balance between them, the parenting equilibrium of a military household where the father was the drill sergeant and the mother was the medic, had held. Imperfectly, with tension, with arguments that happened behind closed doors in voices low enough that the children couldn't hear the words but could hear the tone, and the tone was enough. Children don't need words. They are fluent in tone. They can read the emotional weather of a household the way meteorologists read radar, detecting storms before they arrive, tracking pressure systems, knowing when to seek shelter. I was hard because I was afraid. Seth words, written in a Bible at some point, on some night, by a man sitting alone with the book he read every evening, adding a line that was not scripture but was, in its own way, a prayer, a confession offered upward or inward, or nowhere, just offered. Lucille set the Bible aside the flag, reached back into the footlocker. The next item was a velvet case, small, navy blue, the kind of case that holds medals. Lucille opened it. Inside was a Purple Heart. She stared at it. A Purple Heart is awarded to members of the United States Armed Forces who are wounded or killed while serving. The medal is a purple heart-shaped decoration with a bronze border, bearing the image of George Washington in profile at the center. It is the oldest military decoration still in use, established by Washington himself in 1782. Lucille had never seen this medal. In 38 years of marriage to Philip Harrison, 38 years of shared meals and shared beds and shared boxes and shared moves across 3 continents, he had never shown it to her, never mentioned it, never referenced the wound it represented, never told her the story of the day he was injured, the circumstances, the battle, the pain. He carried it in a footlocker, locked, hidden, stored, the way he carried everything. Her hands were shaking now, not from the cold. The heated seats of the Cadillac had pre-warmed her bones for the drive, and the storage unit was chilly but not cold. Her hands were shaking because she was reaching into a container that held versions of her husband she had never met. A Philip she didn't know. A man with a Purple Heart he never mentioned, and a Bible inscription he never shared, and beneath it all, at the very bottom of the footlocker, resting on the wooden floor like a sediment layer, like the oldest geological stratum, like the thing that was there first and that everything else was placed on top of. 2 envelopes. White, sealed, yellowed at the edges from 30 years of contact with wood. The first envelope was face up. On its front, in Philip's handwriting, for Shaquille. On the back, a date, March 3, 1994. Lucille picked it up, held it to the fluorescent light. The paper was thick enough that she couldn't see through it, couldn't make out the handwriting inside, couldn't preview the words, couldn't know what Philip had written to their son 30 years ago and never delivered. She turned it over. The seal was intact. The adhesive had yellowed but held. The envelope had not been opened, not by Philip, not by anyone. Whatever was inside had been written and sealed and stored in a single act. A continuous gesture of composition and concealment. Write the words, seal the words, lock the words away, move on. Live the next 30 years as if the words don't exist, except they did exist. They had existed for 3 decades, sealed and patient, waiting in the dark at the bottom of a footlocker, with a combination that was a birthday. Lucille set the envelope down. She reached for the second one. It was underneath the first, pressed flat against the wooden bottom, as if it had been placed there first, and the other envelope placed on top of it. A layering, a sequence. The second letter was the foundation. The first letter was the structure built on top of it. Lucille turned it over. The name on the front stopped her breath. Not stopped it dramatically, not the gasp of a movie actress, not the theatrical inhalation of surprise. Stopped it the way a traffic light stops a car. Automatically, a systemic response. The lungs receiving a signal from the brain that said pause and obeying without question. Joseph Tony, 2 words. A name. The name of the man who had fathered Shaquille and left. The name that was spoken in the Harrison household approximately as often as one speaks the name of a disease, rarely, reluctantly, and only when absolutely necessary. The name that Philip had in 38 years of marriage, mentioned perhaps a dozen times, always in the context of contrast. I am here. He is not. That is the difference between us. Joseph Tony, written in Philip's handwriting, on an envelope. In Philip's footlocker, Lucille held both envelopes, one in each hand. The way a person holds 2 objects whose relationship to each other is not yet understood. A key and a lock, a question and an answer, a wound and a bandage. She didn't know which was which. She didn't know what connection existed between a letter written to her son and a letter written to the man she had once loved, and who had left, and who had been replaced by the man who wrote both letters, and who was now 11 years dead, and who had, apparently, been keeping secrets at the bottom of a footlocker with a combination lock set to their son's birthday. She sat on the concrete floor, the way Shaq would sit, 6 days later, in the same storage unit, reading the letter. The way human beings sit when standing is no longer appropriate. When the information being received is too heavy for a vertical posture. When the body needs to be closer to the ground, needs to feel the solidity of the earth beneath it, needs to reduce the distance it could fall. She called Shaq. It was 3:38 p.m. Shaq was in Atlanta. He was at Turner Studios, prepping for that evening's Inside the NBA broadcast. He was in his dressing room. He was eating a meatball sub. The world was normal. The world was the same world it had been that morning and the morning before, and every morning for the last 11 years. A world in which Philip Harrison was dead and gone, and remembered and mourned and filed, the way all dead people are eventually filed, in the cabinet of the past, where they stay, where they are supposed to stay, where the living need them to stay in order to continue the work of living. "Baby," Lucille said, "I found something." Her voice was steady. Lucille's voice was always steady. Steadiness was her instrument. The tool she had used to raise children and manage households and survive relocations and endure the absences of a husband who was periodically deployed to places where people were trying to kill each other and who came home each time slightly different in ways that neither of them discussed. But Shaq heard something beneath the steadiness, a vibration, a frequency below the audible range of normal speech, the frequency of a mother who is holding something she doesn't understand and who has called the only person she trusts to help her understand it. "What did you find, Mom?" "A footlocker, Phillips, with letters in it." "Letters?" "Two, one for you, one for..." She paused. The pause was 2 seconds long. In those 2 seconds, Lucille decided what to say and what not to say. She decided to tell Shaq about the first envelope, the one addressed to him. She decided not to mention the second envelope, the one addressed to Joseph Tony. Not yet. Not on the phone. Not while Shaq was at work, surrounded by cameras and colleagues and the machinery of a life that was about to be rearranged. "One for you," she said. "From Philip. Dated 1994. Silence on Shaq's end. The silence of a meatball sub going still. The silence of a man whose appetite has been interrupted by the sudden, impossible presence of a dead man's handwriting." "I'll be there Thursday," Shaq said. "I'll be here," Lucille said. She hung up. She sat on the concrete floor. She held the 2 envelopes. She looked at the footlocker, empty now, its contents removed, its purpose served, a container that had held its cargo for 30 years, and was now, at 4:41 p.m., on a Tuesday in October, empty. Except it wasn't empty. At the very bottom, scratched into the wood with something sharp, a pen tip, a paperclip, a nail, were 3 words, not written, carved, pressed into the grain with enough force to leave permanent grooves. The kind of marks you make when you want the wood to remember what the paper might not survive. 3 words carved into the bottom of a military footlocker by a man who processed his entire emotional life through acts of physical precision. Creased uniforms, stenciled names, locked containers, words cut into wood. "Feed the boy." Lucille ran her fingers over the grooves. The letters were rough under her fingertips. The wood had darkened around them. 30 years of oxidation turning the exposed grain a deeper brown than the surrounding surface, making the words stand out like veins, like roots, like the lines on a palm that fortune tellers claim can predict the future, but that really only record the past. Feed the boy. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But she would. And Shaq would. And when they did, when the letter was read and the second envelope was opened and the story of Emporia and the room above the hardware store and the 47 unsent letters on a windowsill was finally told, those 3 words carved into the bottom of a footlocker would become the most important words that Philip Arthur Harrison ever wrote. More important than the letter. More important than the confession. More important than the 7 words on the Bible's inside cover. 3 words, carved into wood, by a man who could not say what he felt and so pressed it into the only material he trusted to hold it. Material that doesn't burn easily, doesn't tear, doesn't yellow, doesn't fade. Wood holds, wood remembers. And Philip Harrison, Staff Sergeant, stepfather, the man who stayed, had trusted the bottom of a footlocker with the truth he couldn't trust to air. Feed the boy. To understand the 3 words carved into the bottom of a footlocker, you have to understand the hands that carved them. Philip Arthur Harrison was born on April 14, 1951, in a shotgun house on Plank Road in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A shotgun house is a narrow rectangular dwelling, 1 room wide, 3 or 4 rooms deep, arranged in a straight line so that if you opened the front door and the back door simultaneously and fired a shotgun through the front, the bullet would travel through every room and exit the back without hitting a wall. That's the legend, anyway. The architecture wasn't designed for bullets, it was designed for air. In the suffocating humidity of southern Louisiana, a house arranged in a single line allowed whatever breeze existed to pass through every room at once. A democratic distribution of coolness, in a place where coolness was currency. The Harrison's shotgun house had 4 rooms: front room, middle room, back room, kitchen. No hallway. The rooms simply opened into each other, like train cars, like a sequence, like a sentence in which each word leads directly to the next without punctuation. The front room served as living room, dining room, and, on Sundays, the place where Philip's grandmother, Odessa Harrison, held prayer meetings for women from the neighborhood. 8 or 9 women, sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle, singing hymns and reading scripture, and praying for things that prayer alone was never going to provide, but that they prayed for anyway. Because prayer is not a transaction. It is a discipline. You do it because the doing matters, not because the result is guaranteed. Philip was the 3rd of 5 children. His father, Arthur Bud Harrison, worked at the Georgia Pacific Lumber Mill on Scenic Highway, a sprawling industrial facility that processed pine timber from the forests of East Feliciana Parish into plywood and particle board, and dimensional lumber that was shipped across the country to build houses that were larger and sturdier than the house the man who processed the timber lived in. This was not an irony that Bud Harrison appreciated or even recognized. Irony requires perspective. Perspective requires distance. And Bud Harrison had no distance from his life. He was inside it the way a person is inside their own body. Completely, inescapably, without the ability to step outside and observe the shape of the thing that contains them. Bud worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, 10-hour shifts. He left the house at 5:30 a.m. and returned at 5:30 p.m. 12 hours later, smelling of sawdust and machine oil and the particular chemical sweetness of pine resin. A smell that embedded itself in his clothes and his skin and his hair so thoroughly that Philip, decades later in storage units and hardware stores and lumber yards anywhere in the world, would catch a trace of that smell and feel his father's presence arrive like a ghost, sudden, involuntary, complete. Bud Harrison was not a bad man. He was not a cruel man. He was not a man who hit his children, or drank himself into oblivion, or disappeared for days at a time. The catalog of male failures that populated the stories of other families on Plank Road, families where the father's absence was a wound, and the father's presence was a different kind of wound. Bud was present. Bud was reliable. Bud went to work and came home and went to work and came home with the mechanical regularity of a clock, a human pendulum swinging between the mill and the house and the mill, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for 31 years until his body, which had been converting pine logs into building materials for 3 decades, finally presented its invoice: emphysema, the sawdust, the particulate, the microscopic fragments of wood that he inhaled with every breath on the mill floor and that accumulated in his lungs the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, slowly, imperceptibly, until the river can no longer flow. He died in 1978. He was 54 years old. Philip was 27, already in the Army, already stationed at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, already married to Lucille, already raising a 6-year-old boy named Shaquille, who wasn't his by blood, but was his by choice, which is the harder kind of having, the kind that requires a daily decision, a daily recommitment, a daily answer to the question that biological parenthood never has to: am I still choosing this? Yes, every day. But Bud Harrison's reliable, mechanical, consistent had a hole in it, a gap, a space where something should have been but wasn't. The way a house can have a room that is structurally present but functionally empty. Bud didn't talk, not about himself, not about his feelings. Not about the things that a father is supposed to communicate to a son. Not through lectures or speeches or Hallmark card wisdom, but through the ordinary, daily, accumulative act of sharing inner life. The small revelations, the offhand comments. The "let me tell you something" son moments that don't feel important when they're happening, but that build, over years, into a structure, a framework, an internal architecture that a boy assembles inside himself from the materials his father provides. Bud provided no materials. He provided pine resin and silence. He provided a paycheck and a schedule, and the knowledge that a man goes to work and comes home and goes to work and comes home, and this is what it means to be a man. And there is nothing else to discuss. Philip grew up in that silence. He learned to navigate it the way a sailor learns to navigate open water, by reading the surface for clues about what was underneath. A twitch of Bud's jaw meant anger. A slow exhale through the nose meant disappointment. A hand placed on Philip's shoulder, rare, brief, the hand lifting almost as soon as it landed, as if contact were a hot surface, meant approval. Maybe, possibly. The signals were ambiguous, the decoding was imperfect. Philip spent his childhood as a translator of a language that had no dictionary, interpreting gestures and silences and facial micro-expressions into something he could use, something he could build with, something that resembled. If you squinted, if you tilted your head, if you were willing to accept approximation in place of clarity. Love. He never knew if his father loved him. He believed his father loved him. He chose to believe it. The way a person chooses to believe in God, not because the evidence is conclusive, but because the alternative is unlivable. You believe because you must. You believe because the structure of your life depends on the belief, and without it, the structure collapses, and you are left standing in the rubble of a childhood that had no foundation. Philip chose belief, and he carried the cost of that choice, the perpetual low-grade uncertainty, the splinter of "but what if he didn't?" for the rest of his life. This is what made him hard. Not the Army. The Army didn't make Philip Harrison hard. The Army gave him a framework for hardness that already existed. A vocabulary, a system, a set of regulations and ranks and protocols that transformed his interior rigidity into something external, something visible, something that had a name: discipline. The Army called it discipline, and Philip accepted the name gratefully, because discipline sounds better than "I never learned how to be soft, and I am afraid that if I try, I will discover that softness was never inside me in the first place." He enlisted on June 2, 1969. 18 years old, Vietnam was at its peak. The draft lottery had been instituted that year, a system in which young men's birthdays were drawn at random to determine the order in which they would be called to serve. A system that reduced the most consequential decision of a generation to the mechanics of a bingo game. Philip didn't wait for the lottery. He enlisted. Not because he was patriotic, though he was. Patriotism in the Harrison household was not a political position. It was a weather condition, ambient and constant. The atmospheric pressure of a family that believed in America the way they believed in God, which is to say, completely and without expecting reciprocity. He enlisted because the Army was the only institution in the United States of America that would take a black teenager from Plank Road in Baton Rouge. A teenager with a 10th grade education, a father who communicated in sawdust and silence, a mother who had died when he was 14, breast cancer, 1965, treated too late because the hospital in Baton Rouge that served black patients was understaffed and underfunded, and located across town from the hospital that served white patients, which was fully staffed and fully funded, and 4 blocks from the state capitol, and a grandmother who prayed in the front room and ironed his shirts and told him that God had a plan and give him 4 things. 3 meals a day, a bed, a paycheck, and a chance. 4 things, the minimum viable inputs for a human life: food, shelter, income, opportunity. The Army provided all 4 with the impersonal efficiency of an institution that had been providing them to young men for 200 years. Young men who were poor, who were desperate, who were fleeing something or running towards something, or simply standing still with no other direction available. The Army took them in. The Army fed them. The Army gave them a bed and a purpose, and the first reliable structure many of them had ever experienced. And the Army took some of them apart. Philip was deployed to Vietnam in March 1970. He was 19 years old. He was assigned to the 25th Infantry Division, the Tropic Lightning Division, based at Cu Chi Base Camp in Ho Gia Province, approximately 30 miles northwest of Saigon. The 25th Infantry was responsible for operations in some of the most heavily contested territory in South Vietnam: the Iron Triangle, the Boi Loi Woods, areas where the Viet Cong had constructed elaborate tunnel systems that extended for miles underground and that made conventional warfare a lethal guessing game. Philip served for 11 months. He was wounded on February 4, 1971, a date he never spoke, and that Lucille would discover, decades later, on the back of a Purple Heart that she didn't know existed, in a velvet case at the bottom of a footlocker she had never opened. The wound was to his left leg, shrapnel from a booby trap on a patrol northwest of Cu Chi. 2 fragments of metal entered his calf. One was removed by a field surgeon at the 12th Evacuation Hospital. The other remained, too small to extract safely, too deep to reach without risking nerve damage. It stayed in his leg for the rest of his life, a souvenir, a permanent passenger, a piece of Vietnam that he carried in his body the way he carried everything else, silently, privately, without complaint. He never talked about Vietnam, not to Lucille, not to Shaq, not to his Army buddies, though some of them tried. The tentative, cautious, you remember that time in Cu Chi conversations that veterans sometimes attempt with each other, testing the water, checking whether the other person is willing to go back to that place in their mind. Philip was not willing. The door was closed, the lock was set, the combination was known only to him. He came home. He re-enlisted. He spent the next 26 years in the Army, a career that took him from Fort Bragg to Fort Stewart to bases in Germany and the Philippines and back to the United States. A career that was defined not by combat, but by the long, unglamorous, essential work of peacetime soldiering. Training, maintaining, inspecting, leading. The daily, repetitive, thankless labor of keeping a military machine functional between the wars that justify its existence. He met Lucille in 1974, married her in 1975, adopted Shaq, raised him, was hard on him. Was so hard on him that Shaq, in interviews decades later, would describe their relationship with the careful, calibrated language of a man who loves someone and also carries scars from that someone and has learned, through therapy, through maturity, through the experience of becoming a father himself, to hold both things simultaneously without letting either one cancel the other. My father was a drill sergeant at home, Shaq has said. He treated us like we were in his platoon. Inspections, push-ups, standards. And if you didn't meet the standard, you heard about it. You heard about it until you couldn't hear anything else. But Shaq has also said this: everything I am, he made me. The discipline, the work ethic, the refusal to quit, the understanding that nobody is going to give you anything and that the only things worth having are the things you earn. That came from Philip Harrison. All of it. The love and the scars, the gratitude and the pain. The recognition that a man can be the best thing in your life and the hardest thing in your life, and that these two truths are not in conflict. They are the same truth, viewed from different angles. The way a mountain looks different, depending on whether you're standing at its base or its summit, but is, in both cases, the same mountain. Philip Arthur Harrison retired from the United States Army in 1997 as a staff sergeant, E6, after 28 years of service. He had never been promoted to Sergeant First Class. He had never been offered a commission. He had remained, for nearly 3 decades, in the middle, the sturdy, essential, unglamorous middle, where the actual work of the Army happens. He didn't complain about this. Complaining was not in his vocabulary. Complaining was a form of softness, and softness was a vulnerability. And vulnerability was what happened to boys on Plank Road who didn't have structure, who didn't have discipline, who didn't have someone hard enough to hold them together when the world tried to pull them apart. He retired. He lived quietly. He watched his son become the most famous basketball player on the planet. He watched from a distance, not physical distance, but the emotional distance of a man who has spent his entire life building walls and who cannot, even now, even when the threat is gone and the war is over and the boy is safe, bring himself to take the walls down. He watched from behind the walls. And on March 3, 1994, 3 years before his retirement, 10 years after a secret drive to a town called Emporia in Virginia, he sat at a desk in base housing at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and he wrote 2 letters. One to his son, one to the man his son had never known. He sealed them. He placed them in a footlocker. He locked the footlocker with a combination that was his son's birthday, and he carved 3 words into the bottom of the container. Not on paper, not in ink, but in wood, because paper can be lost and ink can fade, but wood holds. Wood remembers. Wood endures. Feed the boy. 3 words that Philip Harrison could not say to his son's face. 3 words that he trusted to the bottom of a box, instead of to the air between them. 3 words that were not about food, not literally, not in the way that a grocery list is about food or a restaurant menu is about food. 3 words that were about a different kind of nourishment. The kind that a father provides by being present, by staying, by sitting across a table and looking his child in the eye and saying, with his presence, if not his words, "You are mine. I chose you. I am here." The kind of nourishment that Bud Harrison never provided. The kind that Joseph Toney dreamed about in a room above a hardware store in Virginia. The kind that Philip Harrison tried, imperfectly, rigidly, through the only language he knew, which was the language of discipline and standards and the relentless, exhausting, thankless work of being hard enough to hold a family together, to provide every day for 28 years. Feed the boy, not with food, with everything else, with presence, with structure, with the daily uncelebrated, invisible act of staying, of waking up and being there and waking up again, and being there again, and doing this for decades until the boy is a man, and the man is a giant, and the giant has forgotten that the thing that made him was not size or talent or luck, but a staff sergeant who adopted him at 2 years old and never left. This is who Philip Arthur Harrison was, a man who could not say what he felt, who pressed it into wood instead, who locked it in a box, who set the combination to the birthday of the son he was trying to protect. From the world, from softness, from the particular kind of hunger that happens when a father leaves and the empty chair at the table becomes the loudest thing in the room. A man who drove to Emporia, who found Joseph Toney, who saw the room and the letters and the hot plate and came home and never told anyone, who wrote it down, who locked it away, who died 11 years before his son would read it, and who was right about the hunger, about the fear, about the restaurants, about everything, in a way that would take Shaquille O'Neal 52 years, 2 envelopes, and a footlocker with a combination that was his own birthday to understand. But understanding was coming. It was sitting on a concrete floor in a storage unit in Newark, waiting. It had been waiting for 30 years. It could wait 6 more days. Shaq couldn't wait 6 days. He lasted 2. On Wednesday, October 10, 2024, at 6:14 a.m., he was on a Delta flight from Atlanta to Newark Liberty International Airport, first class. Seat 1A, the seat next to 1B, was empty. Not because he bought it, though he sometimes did on commercial flights to avoid the logistical comedy of a 325-pound man sharing an armrest with a stranger. This time 1B was simply unoccupied, a vacancy, an empty space beside him that felt, on this particular morning, like a metaphor he didn't want to examine. He told no one at TNT. He called Jerome Crawford, the same Jerome who had helped him find Maribel and Isa months earlier, and said only, "Cancel everything today. Family matter." Jerome didn't ask questions. Jerome had learned over years of proximity to Shaq that family matter was a locked door, and locked doors were not for knocking on. They were for standing outside of, silently, until the person inside was ready to open them. Shaq didn't bring anyone with him, not Demetrius, his security, not Jerome, not his ex-wife Shawnee, with whom he maintained a close co-parenting relationship, and who was one of the few people on Earth who understood the interior geography of his emotional life. Not any of his children, Sharif, Miles, Amira, Shakir, Miara, Tahira. all of whom would have come without hesitation if he'd asked. Because the O'Neill children had inherited from both their father and their grandfather a loyalty that was structural, load-bearing, the kind that shows up before it's summoned. He went alone, because some things are solitary. Some things require the specific, undiluted, unwitnessed attention of one person standing in front of one truth. Other people in the room, no matter how loved, no matter how trusted, create diffusion. They absorb some of the impact. They soften the landing. And Shaq did not want the landing softened. He wanted to feel it, the full weight of whatever Philip had written, the full force of whatever truth had been sealed for 30 years. He wanted it unmediated. He wanted it raw. He wanted it the way Philip would have wanted it. Direct, no cushioning, standing up. The flight landed at 8:47 a.m. He rented a car at the airport, a black Chevrolet Tahoe, the only vehicle in the Hertz fleet large enough to accommodate him without the kind of contortionist negotiation between knees and dashboard that made driving a comedy of errors. He drove south on the New Jersey Turnpike, then east on I-78, then through the streets of Newark. Streets he knew the way a tongue knows the inside of a mouth. By feel, by memory, by the automatic navigation of a body that has been somewhere so many times it no longer needs directions. Past the Wequahic neighborhood. Past the high school where he first dunked a basketball, or tried to. At 13, his fingers catching the rim but not clearing it, the ball bouncing off the back iron and hitting him in the face. A moment of failure so complete and so public that he went home and did push-ups in his bedroom for 2 hours, because Philip had taught him that the response to humiliation was not retreat but repetition. You failed? Do it again. You failed again. You do it until the failure runs out, and the only thing left is the thing you were trying to do. Past the Boys and Girls Club on South Orange Avenue, the building where Dale Brown first saw him, where a lifetime began, where, in a different story, a different year, a baby named Maribel was saved on a bench outside. That story was months ago. That story was already part of the architecture of Shaq's life, a load-bearing wall, permanent, integrated. But this story was different. This story was older. This story came from the foundation itself. He arrived at Easy's store on Hawthorne Avenue at 9:33 a.m. Lucille was already there. She was sitting in her Cadillac in the parking lot. Engine off. Heated seats on. Because the seats retained warmth for a while after the engine was cut, and Lucille had learned to time her arrivals to maximize the residual heat. A small optimization that reflected the larger truth of how she moved through the world. Efficiently, practically, without wasting anything, including warmth. She was wearing the blue cardigan, the same one she'd worn 2 days earlier when she opened the footlocker. Shaq would later realize that Lucille had been wearing that blue cardigan every time he'd seen her in the last 3 years. It was not a fashion choice, it was an anchor. The cardigan had been a gift from Philip. Christmas 2012, the last Christmas before he died. He had bought it at a Macy's in Orlando. He had not wrapped it. Philip did not wrap gifts. He placed them in bags. Store bags, the bag the item came in. Because wrapping paper was decorative, and Philip did not do decorative. He did functional. A bag is functional. A bag holds the item and delivers the item, and does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. Lucille wore the cardigan because it was the last thing Philip's hands had chosen for her, not the last thing he gave her. That was more complicated, more encompassing, more impossible to reduce to a single object. The last thing he chose, stewed in a store, looked at options, thought about her, selected this one, blue, because he knew she liked blue. Because in 37 years of marriage, he had absorbed that fact. Lucille likes blue. The way wood absorbs moisture, gradually, imperceptibly, until the wood is changed by the thing it absorbed and doesn't remember being dry. Shaq parked the Tahoe next to the Cadillac, got out, walked to Lucille's window. She rolled it down. They didn't speak for a moment. Mother and son, 73 and 52, standing in a parking lot in Newark, New Jersey on a Wednesday morning in October, outside a storage facility where a dead man's words were waiting at the bottom of a footlocker that smelled like canvas and mothballs and 30 years of holding still. "You ready?" Lucille said. "No." Shaq said. "Good, let's go." This was Lucille's philosophy. Readiness is overrated. Readiness is what you wait for, when you're looking for an excuse not to do the thing. The thing doesn't care if you're ready. The thing is there. You walk toward it, or you walk away from it. Lucille did not raise children who walked away. They entered the storage unit together. Gideon waved from the office. He had seen the Cadillac return, and had assumed Mrs. Harrison was continuing her work. He did not recognize the enormous man walking beside her. Gideon did not watch basketball. Gideon watched soccer, specifically Liga MX, the Mexican Professional League, and his frame of reference for famous athletes did not include retired NBA centers. Shaq was, to Gideon, simply a very large man who was related to his most reliable tenant. Unit 14C was as Lucille had left it. The boxes she'd already sorted were stacked near the door: keep, donate, discard. The footlocker was in the back corner, lid open, contents removed. The flag was folded on top of a box labeled Kitchen, Germany. The Bible was beside it. The Purple Heart was in its velvet case on the concrete floor. And the two envelopes were on top of the footlocker's open lid, where Lucille had placed them 2 days earlier, side by side. The way she'd found them, layered, the first on top of the second, but now separated, side by side, so that both names were visible simultaneously. For Shaquille, Joseph, Tony. Shaq stood in front of the footlocker and looked at the envelopes. He didn't reach for them immediately. He stood the way Philip had taught him to stand before important things. Still centered, weight evenly distributed, breathing controlled. The posture of a soldier at rest. The posture of a man who is preparing his body for the impact his mind is about to receive. He looked at his mother. "You didn't open them," he said. "They're not mine to open." The one to Joseph? "Not mine either." Shaq nodded. He understood. Lucille's restraint was not passive. It was principled. It was the expression of a moral code so deeply internalized that it functioned automatically. A code that said, sealed things are sealed for a reason. A man puts words in an envelope and writes a name on the front. Those words belong to that name, not to the finder, not to the wife, not to curiosity or grief or the aching, desperate desire to understand why your dead husband was writing letters to a man he supposedly had no relationship with. The words belong to the name. Both of them? Shaq asked. "You didn't read either one?" Lucille looked at him. The look contained something that Shaq recognized, a specific quality of maternal honesty that Lucille deployed when a question deserved a harder answer than the question expected. "I was tempted," she said. "I'm not a Saint Shaquille. I'm a woman whose husband kept secrets in a footlocker. I wanted to know. I wanted to tear them open the second I found them. I wanted to read every word and understand why a man I slept next to for 38 years had things he couldn't tell me." She paused, adjusted her glasses. The reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. The ones she pushed up her nose when she was about to say something precise. "But I didn't. Because Philip wrote your name on that envelope, not mine. And if he wanted me to read it, he would have written my name. He did. He wrote yours. And a woman who reads a letter addressed to her son is a woman who doesn't trust her son to handle it. And I trust you. I've always trusted you. Even when you were 17 and 6'9" and making decisions that terrified me, I trusted you, because your father raised you to be trusted. And I'm not going to dishonor that by opening an envelope he addressed to you." She pointed at the second envelope. "And that one, the one to Joseph, that's not mine either. It might be yours. It might be nobody's. But it's not mine." Shaq looked at the envelopes. 2 rectangles of yellowed white paper. 2 names in military handwriting. 2 sealed containers within a sealed container. Letters inside a footlocker inside a storage unit. A nesting doll of concealment, each layer adding another degree of separation between the truth and the world. He reached for the first one. For Shaquille, March 3, 1994. He turned it over. The seal was intact. The adhesive had yellowed to a dark amber, the color of old glue, the color of time made visible on paper. He slid his thumb under the flap. The adhesive resisted for a moment. 30 years of bonding, 30 years of molecular commitment to the task of keeping this envelope closed, and then gave way with a soft, papery tearing sound. The sound of a seal breaking. The sound of a door opening that had been closed for 3 decades. Inside were 3 sheets of legal pad paper, lined, written on both sides in blue ballpoint pen. 6 pages of Philip Harrison's handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed Shaq's permission slips, that had written comments on his report cards. Shaquille can do better. He will do better. That had left notes on the kitchen table on mornings when duty called before dawn. Breakfast is in the oven. Do your homework. I'll be home by 1800. Dad, Shaq unfolded the pages. The paper was stiff. 30 years of being folded had creased the sheets into permanent valleys. The kind of creases that don't flatten, that hold their shape even when the paper is opened. A memory of compression written into the fibers themselves. He began to read. Lucille watched him. She watched his eyes move across the first page. She watched his face, the face she had known for 52 years. The face she had memorized the way a cartographer memorizes a landscape. Every contour mapped, every expression catalogued, every micro-movement understood. She watched for the signals. The jaw clench that meant anger, the nostril flare that meant frustration, the slight narrowing of the eyes that meant pain. She saw none of those things. What she saw instead was something she had never seen on her son's face before. She saw recognition, not the recognition of a familiar face or a known fact, a deeper recognition. The recognition that happens when a person reads words that describe something they have felt but never named. When language arrives, for the first time, at a sensation that has been living inside them without a label. The recognition that says, yes, that is what it was, that is what has been. I didn't know it had a word. I didn't know it had a shape. But here it is, in someone else's handwriting, described by someone who felt it too. Shaq read the first page. He turned to the second. His hand was shaking. Not violently, not the dramatic tremor of shock or fear, a fine tremor. The kind that lives at the edges of the fingers, the kind that a surgeon would notice, but a casual observer would miss. The vibration of a man whose nervous system is processing information faster than his body can absorb it. The way a speaker vibrates when the volume exceeds its capacity. Not breaking, but trembling at the boundary of what it can hold. He turned to the third page. Lucille saw his eyes stop. Not blink, not narrow, stop, fix on a point. The way a person's eyes stop when they reach a sentence that detonates inside the paragraph, the way a mine detonates inside a field. Without warning, without sound, with only the sudden, violent rearrangement of everything that was standing on top of it. His eyes stopped on a word, a name, Joseph. And then they moved to the sentence that followed the name. And Shaq sat down. Not the way he sat down in the billing office at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. That had been a collapse, a surrender, a body giving way. This was different. This was deliberate, controlled. The descent of a man who needs to be closer to the ground because the ground is the only thing he trusts right now. Not the words on the paper. Not his own legs. Not the air in this storage unit. The ground. The concrete. The surface that holds everything without asking questions. He sat on the floor of Unit 14C at Easy Store on Hawthorne Avenue in Newark, New Jersey. His back against a box labeled Shaq, J.R. High. His legs extended across the width of the unit, nearly touching the opposite wall. The letter in his hands. 3 pages. 6 sides. 30 years of silence, broken. He finished reading. He read it again. He read it a 3rd time. Then he looked up at Lucille. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but wet in the way that precedes crying, the way that a sky darkens before rain. The moisture gathering. The pressure building. The system approaching the threshold beyond which release becomes inevitable. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did I know what?" "About Joseph. What Philip, what he did." Lucille's face was still. The stillness of a woman who is watching her son process something enormous and who understands, with the wisdom of 73 years and the specific intelligence of motherhood, that her job right now is not to help. Her job is to be present, to be the ground, to be the surface that holds without asking questions. "I don't know what's in the letter, Shaquille. I told you. I didn't read it." "He went to find him, Mom." Silence. "Philip." "He went to Virginia to find Joseph in 1984. He found him in a room above a hardware store in a town called Emporia. He was working in a chicken plant." Lucille's mouth opened slightly. The involuntary parting of lips that happens when the brain receives information that doesn't fit into any existing category. Information that requires the construction of a new category, a new shelf in the mental architecture, a new room in the house of what you know. Joseph was living in one room, Shaq continued. His voice was flat, the same flat he would use 4 days later on the phone with Renata. The flat of a man who is reciting facts because he cannot yet afford to feel them. One pot, one plate, one fork. He was processing chickens at a plant. 1,000 chickens a day, minimum wage. He looked at the letter, then at Lucille, then at the letter again. He had letters, Mom, on the windowsill, 47 letters. All addressed to me, written over years, sealed, stamped, never sent. Lucille's hand found the doorframe of the storage unit. Her fingers pressed against the metal. The gesture was invisible. A small woman touching a door in a storage facility. But it was also the gesture of a person who needs to feel something solid. Because the floor has just shifted and the room has just rearranged itself in the past. The settled, filed, closed and labeled past has just been reopened by 3 pages of blue ballpoint pen on yellow legal paper. He never sent them, Shaq said. 47 letters, he never sent a single one. You know why? Lucille didn't speak. She waited. Because he said he had nothing to offer me. Shaq's voice cracked. Not broke, cracked. The way a surface cracks when pressure is applied from both sides simultaneously, from above and below, from the weight of the words and the weight of the years and the impossible, crushing weight of learning at 52 years old that the man you spent your entire life resenting for leaving had never actually left, had been writing to you from every city, every rented room, every minimum wage job, every chicken plant and motel and bench and bus station, had been composing letters to a son he couldn't face, because facing you would require having something to offer, and he had nothing. Nothing except words on paper, and a dream about a meal and a table, and a father sitting across from his son with a plate of food he'd made with his own hands. He said the only thing he ever wanted to give me was a meal, a real meal, at a table, with his father sitting across from him. Shaq set the letter on his lap. 3 pages of paper, 6 sides of a dead man's handwriting, the weight of a feather, the weight of a planet, and he couldn't even do that. The storage unit was silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Outside, on Hawthorne Avenue, a truck rumbled past. The low, diesel vibration of a delivery vehicle. The sound of commerce. The sound of a world that was continuing to function despite the fact that, inside this 10 by 15-foot rectangle of concrete and metal, a 52-year-old man was learning that the story he had told himself about his own life, the story of the father who left and the father who stayed, the binary, the clean division, the good and the bad, was wrong. Not wrong like a math error. Wrong like a map that shows a river running east when the river runs west. Wrong like a foundation that was poured on a misunderstanding. Wrong in the way that changes not just what you know but how you know. The method itself, the process of constructing a life narrative, the confidence you had that the narrative was complete. The narrative was not complete. It had never been complete, because there was a room in Emporia that Shaq had never known about, and letters on a windowsill that he would never read, and a man named Joseph Tony who processed 1,000 chickens a day and dreamed about a table and died alone in 2004 in a rented room at the age of 54 without ever sitting across from his son. And because there was a second envelope. Shaq picked it up, the one addressed to Joseph Tony, in Philip's handwriting. Sealed, 30 years. This was under mine, Shaq said. Lucille nodded. He was going to send it to Joseph, and then he didn't. Lucille nodded again. Why? I don't know, baby. Open it. 1 sheet of paper. 1 side. Blue ballpoint pen. He read it out loud to Lucille, to the storage unit, to the fluorescent lights and the concrete floor and the olive drab footlocker and the flag and the Bible and the purple heart and the boxes labeled in Sharpie, and the 35 years of a family's life compressed into a 10 by 15 room on Hawthorne Avenue. He read it out loud because some words need to be spoken. Some words have been silent too long. Some words, sealed in envelopes, locked in footlockers, stored in darkness, have been waiting 30 years to be heard. and reading them silently would be another form of burial, another layer of concealment, another lock on a box that has been locked long enough. He read, "Joseph, I went to Emporia. I saw the room. I saw the letters. I understand now. I will raise your son. I will do my best. But I need you to know, he has your hunger. It is in him. I can see it. I will try to make sure he uses it to feed others and not just himself. I cannot promise I will succeed, but I will try. Philip Harrison." Shaq set the letter down. He looked at the footlocker, at the bottom, at the 3 words carved into the wood, "Feed the boy." He understood now. Not everything, not yet. Understanding would come in stages the way light comes in the morning. Not all at once, but gradually. The horizon brightening by degrees until the thing you couldn't see an hour ago is fully visible, and you realize it was there the whole time, waiting for enough light to be seen. But he understood the shape of it, the outline, the architecture of a secret that Philip Harrison had carried for 30 years. The secret of a drive to Virginia, a room above a hardware store, 47 unsent letters, and a man who processed 1,000 chickens a day and couldn't feed his own son. He understood that Philip had seen Joseph, had witnessed the hunger, had come home and decided, not with words. Because Philip didn't use words for decisions, he used actions to do what Joseph couldn't. To feed the boy, to stay, to be present, to provide the meals and the structure, and the daily, unglamorous, exhausting act of fatherhood that Joseph Tony had dreamed about on a windowsill in Emporia and never achieved. And he understood something else, something that the letter made explicit and that Philip's entire life had made implicit without Shaq ever recognizing it. Philip was hard on Shaq because he was afraid that the hunger, Joseph's hunger, the generational, inherited, genetic hunger of a man who can't provide for his family and who is destroyed by the inability, would express itself in Shaq as something other than fuel. Afraid that the hunger would become greed. Afraid that the talent and the size and the money and the fame would take the hunger and twist it. The way a river can be twisted by a dam, redirected, forced into channels that lead somewhere useful or somewhere destructive, depending on who built the dam and why. Philip built the dam. Discipline was the dam. Hardness was the dam. Push-ups and inspections, and the relentless, impossible standards that Shaq could never fully meet. These were the walls of a channel that Philip was constructing around his son's hunger, trying to direct it, trying to shape it, trying to ensure that the hunger flowed toward service instead of consumption. "I will try to make sure he uses it to feed others and not just himself." That line. That single line in a letter to a man who never received it. The mission statement of Philip Harrison's entire approach to fatherhood. Written not to Shaq but to Joseph, as if Philip needed Joseph's permission. As if the letter was a contract between 2 fathers, one present and one absent, agreeing on the terms of a child's upbringing. One would do the work. The other would do the dreaming. And between them, across the distance of unconnected lives and unsent letters and rooms above hardware stores, in towns that nobody visits, they would raise a boy. Together, apart. The same thing, Shaq sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit for a long time. Lucille sat beside him, not on the floor. Her knees would not permit the floor. She sat on the folding chair she'd brought from the Cadillac. A chair she'd had for 11 years. A chair she'd sat in at Philip's funeral. She sat next to her son and she didn't speak. And she didn't touch him and she didn't try to fill the silence with comfort. Because Lucille understood, had always understood, had understood since before Shaq was born, that some silences are not empty. Some silences are full. Some silences are the sound of a person rearranging the furniture inside themselves, moving the heavy pieces, the pieces that have been in the same place for decades, the pieces that everyone assumed were permanent. And the rearranging takes time, and the time requires quiet. And the quiet is not a void. It is a workspace. Shaq was rearranging. He was moving Joseph Tony from one room to another. From the room labeled the man who left to a room that didn't have a label yet. A new room, built in the last 45 minutes from the materials in a 30-year-old letter. A room that was still under construction, still unfinished, still missing its ceiling and its floor, but that had walls. Walls made of 47 unsent letters. Walls made of a dream about a table. Walls made of 1,000 chickens a day and a hot plate and one pot. And one plate and one fork, and a man who couldn't feed his son and was eaten alive by the inability. The new room was not forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness is a later renovation. It requires a foundation, and the foundation requires understanding, and understanding had only just arrived. Still wet, still settling, not yet load-bearing. But the room existed now. It was open. It had space for Joseph Tony to be something other than the man who left. Something more complicated. Something sadder. Something that didn't fit in the old binary, the father who stayed, the father who left, because the truth, as it turned out, was not a binary at all. It was a spectrum, a continuum, a range of fatherhood that stretched from Philip's rigid, daily physical presence to Joseph's desperate, silent, epistolary absence. And both points on that spectrum were occupied by men who loved their son and couldn't say it and found other ways. Push-ups and unsent letters, carved wood, and stamped envelopes to hold the words they couldn't speak. Two fathers, two forms of silence, two kinds of hunger, and a boy, now a man, now a giant, now sitting on a concrete floor with a letter in his lap and a new room opening inside his chest, who had been fed by both of them, without knowing it, until now. Shaq flew back to Atlanta that evening. He didn't go to Turner Studios. He didn't go to his penthouse in Buckhead. He drove the rental Tahoe from Newark Liberty International Airport to the long-term parking garage, returned it, boarded the 4:15 p.m. Delta flight to Hartsfield-Jackson landed at 7:02 p.m., collected his car from the airport lot. A Mercedes Maybach GLS 600 black, a vehicle that cost more than Philip Harrison earned in his entire military career. A fact that Shaq had never thought about before today, and that he could not stop thinking about now. And drove not toward Atlanta but away from it, south, toward a Waffle House on Old National Highway in College Park. Not the Waffle House on Ponce de Leon Avenue, which was his usual spot. The one near Turner Studios, the one where the staff knew his order and had long since stopped being impressed by his size and simply treated him as a man who wanted hash browns scattered, smothered, and covered, which is exactly how Shaq wanted to be treated. A man, not a celebrity, not a brand. A man at a counter, eating breakfast food at a time of day that was not breakfast, because breakfast food doesn't care about clocks, and neither does grief. He went to the Waffle House on Old National Highway because it was the Waffle House closest to where Philip Harrison had lived during his final years. A modest 3-bedroom house in Jonesboro, Georgia, a house that Shaq had bought for Philip and Lucille in 2003, and that Philip had accepted reluctantly, grudgingly, with the specific discomfort of a man who had spent his entire adult life earning everything he had, and who viewed his son's wealth the way a riverbank views a rising river, with respect, with wariness, with the knowledge that the same force that provides can also overwhelm. Philip accepted the house because Lucille wanted it, because Lucille had spent 28 years in military housing, government-issued, regulation-compliant, impersonal housing that changed every 2 to 3 years, housing that you were not allowed to modify or personalize or attach to because attachment was a luxury the military did not provide. Lucille wanted her own walls, her own kitchen, a yard, a mailbox with her name on it. The elemental, irreducible markers of permanence. The things that say this is mine in the language of property ownership. A language that military families learn late or never. Philip accepted the house. He moved in. He mowed the lawn every Saturday at 7 a.m. with the precision of a man conducting a military operation. The same pattern every week, north-south stripes, overlapping by exactly 2 inches, the mower running at a constant speed. The lines so straight that a neighbor once asked if he used a surveyor's level. He didn't. He used his eyes. His eyes were the surveyor's level. 30 years of military discipline had calibrated his visual perception to a tolerance that most instruments couldn't match. He lived in that house for 10 years, from 2003 until September 22, 2013, the day he died. Shaq pulled into the Waffle House parking lot at 8:14 p.m. The lot was half full, the eternal state of a Waffle House parking lot in the greater Atlanta area, because Waffle Houses in Atlanta are never empty and never full. They exist in a permanent state of moderate occupancy, a consistent, reliable, mathematically improbable equilibrium that has never been adequately explained by economists or physicists or anyone else who has attempted to model the behavioral dynamics of a restaurant chain that serves 145 million waffles a year and never closes. Ever. Not for holidays, not for natural disasters. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, famously uses what it calls the Waffle House Index to assess the severity of a disaster. If the local Waffle House is closed, the situation is catastrophic. The fact that this is a real metric, used by an actual federal agency, tells you everything you need to know about the role that Waffle House plays in the American psyche. It is not a restaurant. It is infrastructure. It is the floor beneath the floor. It is the thing that stays open when everything else closes. The way a heart keeps beating when the rest of the body shuts down. Shaq sat at the counter. Not a booth. Booths required him to fold himself into geometries that his body found offensive. The counter was better. The counter was a flat surface with a stool that he could straddle without constraint, his knees on either side, his size accommodated by the openness of the arrangement. No walls, no partitions. Just the counter, the grill behind it, and a waitress. Her name was Tondra. Tondra was 53 years old. She had worked at this Waffle House for 9 years. She had red acrylic nails and glasses that sat on the tip of her nose, and a disposition that communicated, without variation, the following message: I am here. I will bring you what you ordered. I will not perform enthusiasm. I will not pretend that this encounter is magical. You are hungry. I have food. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. Shaq loved Tondra, not in the way that word is usually meant, not romantically, not sentimentally. He loved her in the specific way that you love a person who treats you like a person, who doesn't photograph you or ask for autographs or tell you that their nephew played basketball at a Division III school and is basically as tall as you, just not as wide. Tondra treated Shaq the way she treated every customer who sat at her counter, with competence, efficiency, and the minimum necessary amount of conversation. What you want, baby? Tondra said. She called everyone baby. It was not an endearment. It was a pronoun, a universal, gender-neutral, age-agnostic form of address that saved Tondra the trouble of learning names, which she considered an unreasonable expectation given the volume of customers she served, and the limited storage capacity of a brain that was already occupied with order tickets and table rotations, and the ongoing question of whether her ex-husband, Donnell, was ever going to return the air fryer he borrowed in March. Hash browns, Shaq said. All the way. All the way meant every topping Waffle House offered, scattered, spread on the grill, smothered onions, covered chunked hams, diced tomatoes, peppered, jalapenos, capped, mushrooms, and topped chili. It was not a health-conscious order. It was a monument to caloric excess. It was the kind of order that a nutritionist would classify as an event rather than a meal. Shaq ordered it because Philip Harrison had ordered it. Every time, at every Waffle House, from the first time he took Shaq to a Waffle House in 1986, when they were stationed at Fort Stewart, and Shaq was 14 years old and already too tall for the booth, and they sat at the counter instead, and Philip said, "Order everything. A man should know what everything tastes like." A man should know what everything tastes like. That sentence, that single sentence delivered casually, without preamble, without emphasis in the fluorescent-lit, grease-fragrant, coffee-stained democracy of a Waffle House at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night in 1986. That sentence had been, without Shaq recognizing it at the time or for the next 3 decades, the most important sentence Philip Harrison ever spoke to him. Not because of the food, not because of the hash browns, because of the word everything. Because Philip, who had grown up on Plank Road in Baton Rouge, eating what was available, which was often not much, which was sometimes crackers and government cheese, and the specific, bland, nutritionally adequate but spiritually empty food of poverty, was telling his son something that had nothing to do with Waffle House toppings. He was telling him to be hungry, not hungry for food, hungry for experience, hungry for the world. Hungry in the way that Philip had been hungry as a boy, hungry for options, for choices, for the right to sit at a counter and point at a menu and say that one and that one and that one, without calculating whether he could afford it. The hunger of a man who grew up with nothing, and who wanted his son to grow up knowing what everything tasted like. Every opportunity, every challenge, every dimension of being alive, so that the boy would never confuse scarcity with normalcy, so that the boy would never accept less because he didn't know more existed. Order everything. A man should know what everything tastes like. The hunger, Joseph's hunger, Philip's hunger, Shaq's hunger. 3 generations of the same fire, passed from father to father to father's son. The genetic, spiritual, inextinguishable appetite for more. More life, more experience, more of whatever the world was willing to give, and when the world wasn't willing, more anyway. Taken, earned, demanded, built. Shaq sat at the Waffle House counter and ate hash browns and thought about March 3, 1994. The date on the letter. To understand why Philip wrote the letter on that specific date, not a week earlier, not a month later, but on March 3, 1994, at a desk in base housing at Fort Stewart, Georgia, with a blue ballpoint pen and a legal pad, and the house empty and the quiet pressing in. You have to understand what was happening in Shaq's life at that exact moment, what Philip was watching, what he was afraid of. March 3, 1994, a Thursday. Shaquille O'Neal was 21 years old. He was in his second season with the Orlando Magic, the team that had selected him with the first overall pick in the 1992 NBA draft. The pick that everyone knew was coming, the pick that was as certain as sunrise, because Shaq had spent 3 years at Louisiana State University demolishing the Southeastern Conference with a physical dominance that made opposing centers look like children being asked to guard a building. His second season was a statement. Not just a basketball season, a cultural event. Shaq was averaging 29.3 points per game. He was averaging 13.2 rebounds. He was shooting .599 from the field. A percentage so absurd that it essentially meant if Shaquille O'Neal gets the ball near the basket, the ball is going in, and there is nothing you or your team or the laws of physics can do about it. He was also becoming something else. Something beyond basketball. He was becoming a brand, a product, a corporation made of flesh. The endorsement deals were multiplying. Pepsi, Reebok, Spalding, Kenner, Tiger Electronics, Electronic Arts. Each deal added a zero to his income and a layer to his public persona. Each deal made him more famous and less private. Each deal transformed another piece of Shaquille O'Neal, the person, into Shaq, the commodity. He released a rap album, Shaq Diesel, in October 1993, 5 months before Philip wrote the letter. The album went platinum. It sold over 1 million copies. This was remarkable not because the music was exceptional. It was competent, energetic, carried by Shaq's charisma and novelty more than by lyrical sophistication, but because it demonstrated something about Shaq's hunger that Philip was watching with increasing alarm. The hunger had no boundary. It didn't stop at basketball. It wanted everything. Music, movies, television, business. The full spectrum of American celebrity, consumed and inhabited and dominated with the same physical aggression that Shaq brought to the low post. Philip watched. He watched from Fort Stewart, Georgia, from base housing, from the disciplined, regimented, $38,000 a year reality of a staff sergeant's life. He watched his son's world expand. Watched it through television screens and newspaper headlines and the occasional phone call that was shorter than it used to be. Not because Shaq loved him less, but because Shaq's time had been colonized by people and obligations and opportunities that didn't exist 2 years ago and that now occupied every available minute. He watched the distance grow. The distance was not measurable in miles. Fort Stewart to Orlando was approximately 270 miles, a 4-hour drive, a 1-hour flight, a distance that could be crossed on any given day. But the distance Philip felt was not geographic, it was gravitational. Shaq was becoming a planet, a massive, luminous, inescapable celestial object, and the people in his orbit were being sorted by proximity to his light. Agents, managers, publicists, handlers, brand strategists, personal assistants. These people occupied the inner orbits. They were close. They were necessary. They spoke the language of Shaq's new world, the language of contracts and appearances and media cycles and brand equity. Philip spoke a different language, the language of push-ups and inspections and make your bed boy and the quiet, grinding, unamplified love of a man who shows up every day and does the work and doesn't talk about it because talking about it would be a form of softness, and softness is not permitted. That language was becoming inaudible. Not because Shaq had stopped listening, because the volume of everything else had increased. The noise of fame, the roar of money, the deafening cacophony of a 21-year-old life that was expanding in every direction simultaneously. And Philip's frequency, which had always been low, which had always been a bass note rather than a treble, was being drowned out. Philip felt it. He felt himself becoming quieter in his son's life. Not because Shaq was pushing him away. Shaq was not that kind of son. He called. He visited. He sent money that Philip accepted with discomfort and Lucille accepted with gratitude. But the calls were shorter. The visits were briefer. The money was larger. And the proportion of Shaq's attention that was available for a staff sergeant at Fort Stewart was shrinking, contracting, receding like a tide. Not because the ocean had less water, but because the shoreline had expanded. And on March 3, 1994, something specific happened that made Philip sit down and write. Shaq was on television, not playing basketball, not dunking or blocking or grabbing rebounds. He was on a talk show. Philip didn't record the name in the letter. It may have been Arsenio Hall or Letterman or one of the others that Shaq appeared on during that period, because Shaq appeared on everything during that period. He was on a talk show, and the host asked him about his business ventures, and Shaq talked about the endorsement deals and the album and the movie offers and the merchandise and the revenue, and he was funny and charming and enormous and magnetic, and at one point the host asked him what he wanted next. What was the next thing on the list? And Shaq laughed. The big laugh. The Shaq laugh, the laugh that fills a studio the way his body fills a room, and said, "Restaurants, man. I want to own restaurants. 100 restaurants. 200. I want to feed the whole country." The audience laughed. The host laughed. Shaq laughed. It was a throwaway line. A late-night television quip. The kind of thing that famous people say when they're riffing, when they're performing the version of themselves that audiences expect. The version that is larger and louder and more ambitious than the real person underneath. But Philip didn't hear a quip. Philip heard a prophecy. I want to own restaurants. I want to feed the whole country. And something inside Philip, something in the deep, military, structurally reinforced interior of a man who processed his emotions the way the army processed recruits. Through discipline and categorization and the systematic elimination of anything that didn't serve the mission, that something activated, like an alarm, like a motion sensor in a dark hallway, like the instinct that had kept him alive in the tunnels of Ku Chi when every shadow could be a threat, and the only defense was vigilance. He heard the hunger in Shaq's voice, not the hunger for food, not the hunger for success, the other hunger, the one that Philip had seen 10 years earlier, in a room above a hardware store in Emporia, Virginia. Joseph's hunger. The hunger of a man who processes 1,000 chickens a day and can't feed his own son. The hunger that sounds like ambition but is actually a vacuum. A hole shaped like a father. A hole that no amount of money or fame or restaurants or platinum albums can fill, because the hole wasn't created by a lack of money or fame or restaurants. It was created by a man who left. And the only thing that can fill a hole shaped like a father is a father. Philip heard the hunger, and he recognized it, and he was afraid. Not afraid of Shaq, afraid for him. Afraid that the hunger, the inheritance, the generational transmission that passed from Alton Tony's destroyed barbershop to Joseph Tony's rented room to Shaq's expanding empire, would express itself as consumption rather than nourishment, would build things that fed pride instead of people, would own instead of serve, would accumulate instead of provide, would become, in other words, the thing that Philip had spent 20 years trying to prevent. A man who has everything and feeds no one. Philip sat at the desk. The house was empty. Lucille was at the commissary. The television was off. He had turned it off after Shaq's comment, turned it off with the deliberate, controlled gesture of a man removing a stimulus that was producing an unacceptable response. The screen went dark, the house went quiet, and in the quiet, Philip picked up a blue ballpoint pen and a legal pad and began to write. He wrote for an hour, maybe 2. The letter doesn't indicate how long it took. It contains no timestamps, no marginal notes, no evidence of pauses or revisions. The handwriting is consistent throughout. The same pressure, the same angle, the same military precision on page 6 as on page 1. Either Philip wrote without stopping, or he stopped and restarted so seamlessly that the interruption left no trace. He wrote about Bud Harrison, about the lumber mill, about sawdust and silence, about a father who was present every day for 31 years and who never once said, "I love you," or "I'm proud of you," or "Let me tell you something, son." A father whose love was a fact that could not be proven, only inferred, only chosen to believe. He wrote about Vietnam, briefly, obliquely, not about the combat or the tunnels or the shrapnel in his leg. Those details were too deep, too locked, too far inside the footlocker of his psyche to be retrieved by a blue ballpoint pen. He wrote one sentence about Vietnam. "I learned there that a man can be alive and empty at the same time, and that the difference between living and surviving is whether anyone is waiting for you to come home." He wrote about Joseph, about the drive to Emporia, about the room, about the 47 letters, about the hot plate and the one plate and the one fork and the one pot and the dream about a meal. The dream of sitting across a table from his son and putting food in front of him and watching him eat. He wrote about the hunger. "He has your hunger," he wrote to Shaq, and also simultaneously to Joseph, because the letter was addressed to Shaq, but portions of it were spoken to Joseph, as if Philip were conducting a three-way conversation between two men who would never meet, and a boy who didn't know he was being discussed. "He has your hunger. It is in him. I can see it. I have been watching it grow since he was 12 years old and 6 feet tall, and the world started looking at him the way the world looks at things it wants to use. The hunger is not bad. The hunger is what made him. The hunger is what will make him great. But hunger can also make a man empty. Hunger can make a man build 1,000 tables and never sit down at one. Hunger can make a man feed the whole country and forget to feed his own child. Hunger can make a man own everything and nourish nothing. I am afraid of this. I am afraid because I have seen it. I have seen it in Joseph. I have seen it in my own father. I have seen it in every man I ever served with who came home from war and couldn't sit at his own kitchen table without feeling the distance between himself and the people who were waiting for him. The distance is the hunger. The hunger is the distance. And then the confession. I was hard on you because I was trying to build a wall around the hunger. I was trying to contain it, to shape it, to make sure it flowed toward other people instead of away from them. I did not know how to do this except by being hard, because hard is the only tool I have. Softness was not given to me. It was not in the house I grew up in. It was not in the army. It was not in the tunnels or the hospitals or the flag-draped coffins. Softness was removed from me piece by piece over decades, and I did not notice it was gone until I tried to reach for it and found the shelf empty. I am sorry. I am sorry that my love looked like discipline. I am sorry that my fear looked like anger. I am sorry that the thing I was trying to give you, protection, structure, the ability to carry the hunger without being carried away by it, came wrapped in a packaging that made it look like something else, something harder, something colder, something that you may have spent your childhood trying to get warm against and failing, because you cannot get warm against a wall. You can only lean on it, and leaning is not the same as being held. I should have held you more. I should have said the words. I should have told you about Joseph, about the room, about the letters, about the dream. I should have told you that the man who left you was not a villain. He was a casualty, a man destroyed by the same forces that destroyed my father and that tried to destroy me, and that I have spent my entire life trying to prevent from destroying you. I should have told you that he loved you. I didn't, because telling you that he loved you would have meant that my love was not enough, that no matter how hard I was, no matter how many push-ups I assigned, no matter how many inspections I conducted, no matter how tightly I made the bed, There was a piece of you that I could not reach, a piece that belonged to him. A piece shaped exactly like a man I could never replace, because you cannot replace a father with a father. You can only add. You can only stand beside the empty space and say, I am here too. I am also here. I was also here, Shaquille. For 22 years, I was also here. And if the only thing you remember about me, after the championships, and the money, and the restaurants, and all of it, if the only thing you carry from me into whatever comes next, let it be this. Build something that feeds people, not customers. People. Build the table that Joseph dreamed about. The table where a father sits across from his son and they eat together. And the meal is not about money. It is about presence. It is about the act of providing, not providing a product, not providing a commodity, not providing a transactions disguised as nourishment, but providing the thing that every hungry person actually needs, which is the knowledge that someone made this for you. Someone stood in a kitchen and cooked this and put it on a plate and carried it to a table and set it down in front of you and sat across from you and watched you eat and was filled, not by the food but by the watching. That is what Joseph wanted to give you. That is what I tried to give you. That is what I am asking you to give to someone else. Feed the boy, Shaquille. Not your boy, not your son, not your family, the boy. The one sitting somewhere right now, in a room like Joseph's room, at a table like Joseph's table, which is to say, no table at all. The one whose father left, or whose father was taken, or whose father is sitting in the same room, but has become empty. The way my father became empty, after the mill took everything. That boy is hungry. Feed him, not with restaurants, with a table. Tandra refilled Shaq's coffee. He hadn't asked for a refill. Tandra didn't ask whether people wanted refills. Tandra operated on the principle that an empty coffee cup was a problem, and that problems should be solved without discussion. She refilled the cup. She moved on. Shaq held the cup. The ceramic was warm. Waffle House coffee is not good coffee. It is the opposite of good coffee. It is the platonic ideal of mediocre coffee. Coffee that tastes like coffee, the way fluorescent light looks like light. Technically correct, but spiritually incomplete. But it was warm. And the warmth traveled from the cup to his hands, to his arms, to the center of his chest, where a letter written 30 years ago was still detonating, still rearranging the furniture, still knocking things off shelves that had been in the same place for decades. He thought about the restaurants, 155 Five Guys locations, 9 Papa John's, 17 Auntie Anne's, Krispy Kreme, Big Chicken. He thought about what they were: businesses, franchise operations, revenue streams, brand extensions, line items on a financial statement, entries in a portfolio, boxes on an organizational chart, each one generating income, each one employing people, each one producing food and selling it to customers who paid for it and consumed it and left and were replaced by the next customer who paid and consumed and left. A cycle, a machine, an engine that converted ingredients into profit with the mechanical efficiency that the Georgia Pacific lumber mill had converted pine trees into plywood. The same kind of operation, the same logic, the same fundamental transaction. Input, process, output, revenue. That's what the restaurants were. He thought about what they weren't. They weren't tables, not in Philip's sense, not in Joseph's sense, not in the sense that a man sitting in a room above a hardware store, surrounded by 47 unsent letters, dreaming of a meal he couldn't afford to cook. Not in the sense that man would have recognized. The restaurants fed customers. They fed revenue targets. They fed a brand. They fed a portfolio. They fed the hunger. Shaq's hunger, the generational, inherited, inextinguishable appetite for more, by converting it into something the world could measure. Numbers, locations, year-over-year growth, market share. But they did not feed the boy, the one sitting somewhere right now, in a room like Joseph's room, at a table like Joseph's table, which is to say, no table at all. The restaurants did not feed that boy. The restaurants were not designed to feed that boy. The restaurants were designed to feed the machine. The machine was designed to feed the hunger. And the hunger, Philip saw it, Philip named it, Philip carved it into the bottom of a footlocker in 3 words that wood would hold when paper couldn't, was the wrong kind of feeding. The hunger was eating Shaq from the inside, not financially. Financially, the hunger had made him rich beyond imagination. But financially is not the only way a man can be measured, and rich is not the only thing a man can be, and a portfolio worth $180 million is not the same thing as a table where a father sits across from his son and watches him eat and is filled. Shaq understood this now. He understood it in the Waffle House on Old National Highway at 9:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in October, sitting at a counter where his stepfather had once told him to order everything because a man should know what everything tastes like. He understood that Philip was right. He understood that the restaurants were the hunger, and he understood what he had to do. 4 days later, on Monday, October 14, 2024, he stood in his kitchen in Buckhead, picked up the phone, and called Renata Solano Vickers. Sell the restaurants, all of them. Can you at least tell me why? My father told me to, Philip told him, from the bottom of a footlocker. In 3 words carved into wood, in 6 pages of blue ballpoint pen on yellow legal paper, in a letter that was also a blueprint, in a confession that was also a mission. Feed the boy, not with restaurants, with a table. The first thing Shaq did after calling Renata was try to find Joseph Tony, not through Jerome, not through a private investigator, not through the network of assistants and fixers and specialists that wealthy people deploy when they need to locate someone. The paid professionals who treat the finding of human beings as a logistical problem, reducible to databases and public records, and the algorithmic harvesting of digital footprints. Shaq did it himself. He sat at the desk in his penthouse study, a room that had been designed as a home office, but that functioned primarily as a shrine to productivity that Shaq rarely used, because Shaq did not work at desks. Shaq worked in motion. He worked in cars, in dressing rooms, phone calls taken while pacing hallways that his stride crossed in 4 steps. A desk was a stationary object, and Shaq was not a stationary person. But this task required sitting. This task required the specific, deliberate, grounded patience of a man who is searching for someone and who does not want to outsource the searching, because the searching is part of the finding, and the finding is part of the grieving, and the grieving is part of the understanding, and all of it, the whole chain, needs to happen inside one person, connected, undeleted, felt. He sat at the desk. He opened his laptop, a MacBook Pro, the 16-inch model, which in his hands looked like a greeting card, the kind of proportional absurdity that defined his relationship with all standard-sized objects. He typed a name into the search bar, Joseph Tony. The results were sparse. Joseph Tony was not a man who had generated a digital footprint. He was born in 1949. He lived in rented rooms. He worked in processing plants and warehouses and the kind of low-wage, high-turnover jobs that don't produce LinkedIn profiles or company bios, or the searchable residue that the internet creates for people who participate in the formal economy. Joseph Tony existed in the margins, the spaces between databases, the gaps in the record, the unmapped territory where people live and work and dream and die without leaving a trace that a search engine can find. Shaq tried variations: Joseph A. Tony, Joseph Tony Newark NJ, Joseph Tony Emporia VA. He tried public records databases. He tried the white pages. He tried a people search site that charged $29.99 for a comprehensive background report and that returned 3 Joseph Tonys, none of whom matched, one in Texas, born 1982, one in Ohio, born 1971, one in California, born 1955, still living, with Shaq's chest seized at for a moment before he read the details and realized the middle name was wrong, and the birth state was wrong, and this was not his father. This was someone else's father, someone else's absence, someone else's 47 unsent letters. He called Lucille. Mom, do you know where Joseph is? The question landed in the phone line the way a stone lands in a lake, with a plunk, a disruption, concentric ripples spreading outward into the silence that followed. Lucille did not answer immediately. The pause was 3 seconds long. In Lucille time, 3 seconds was an epoch. Lucille did not pause. Lucille moved through conversations the way she moved through everything. Decisively, without wasted motion, each word placed with the efficiency of a woman who had been communicating clearly for 73 years and who did not intend to start being ambiguous now. The 3-second pause told Shaq that this question was different. This question touched something. "I don't know where he is," Lucille said. "I haven't known since before you were born. He was in Emporia, Virginia, in 1984. Philip found him there. I know, you told me. I didn't know before you told me. Has anyone in the family, anyone, been in contact with him? Aunts, cousins? Anyone in Newark?" Another pause, shorter this time. 1 second. The pause of a woman who is reviewing her mental files, the comprehensive, meticulously organized, decades-deep archive of family information that Lucille maintained in her head the way a librarian maintains a catalog. Every name, every relationship, every connection and disconnection and estrangement and reconciliation. The entire genealogy of obligation and love and resentment and forgiveness that constitutes an extended Black family in America. A network so complex that sociologists have spent careers trying to map its dynamics and have consistently failed, because the dynamics are not mappable. They are musical, they are jazz, they are improvised and syncopated, and they follow rules that the players invent as they go. "Your Aunt Vivica," Lucille said. "Vivica Tonybanks, Joseph's sister. She lived in East Orange. She might know. Is she still alive? She was at Easter dinner in 2018. After that, I don't know." Shaq found Vivica Tonybanks through a method that no database could replicate and no algorithm could improve upon. He called the church, Greater Mount Calvary Baptist Church in East Orange, New Jersey. The church that Vivica had attended since the 1970s. The church that, in Black communities across America, functions as more than a place of worship. It functions as a post office, a town hall, a social services agency, a mental health clinic, an employment network, and a living directory of every person who has ever passed through its doors. You want to find someone in a Black neighborhood? You call the church, you ask for the pastor, you explain who you are and who you're looking for. And the pastor either knows or knows someone who knows, or knows someone who knows someone who knows, because the church's network is deeper than the internet, and older than every database, and runs on a technology that Silicon Valley has never managed to replicate. Trust. The pastor at Greater Mount Calvary was a man named Reverend Clarence Alston. He was 78 years old. He had been pastoring the church since 1986, 38 years. He had baptized approximately 2,000 people. He had married approximately 800 couples. He had buried approximately 2,200 members of his congregation. He knew everyone. Not in the shallow, professional networking sense of knowing, the exchanged business cards, LinkedIn connection, nice to meet you kind of knowing. He knew people the way a doctor knows a body, from the inside. He knew their ailments, their secrets, their sins, their griefs, their addictions, their affairs, their bankruptcies, their miracles. He knew which families hadn't spoken in 20 years and why. He knew which marriages were holding and which were hollow. He knew which teenagers were headed for trouble and which were headed for college and which were headed for both. He knew Vivica. "Vivica Tonybanks," Reverend Alston said when Shaq called. His voice was the specific voice of an elderly Black pastor, a bass baritone so deep it seemed to originate not from his throat, but from somewhere underneath the church itself, from the foundation, from the ground, from the geological stratum of faith and history and survival that the building was constructed on. "Yes, I know Vivica. She's in a nursing facility now, Holly Glen Care Center in Montclair. She had a stroke in 2021. Left side, she's managing. Managing was pastor speak. It meant alive. It meant present. It did not mean well. It meant specific state of being that exists between recovery and decline. The plateau, the holding pattern. The managed care equilibrium where the body has stopped getting worse but has not started getting better, and may never start getting better, and the family has been told prepare, which is a medical word that means grieve in advance. "Can I visit her?" Shaq asked. "May I ask who's calling?" "My name is Shaquille O'Neal. Joseph Tony was my biological father." Silence. The silence of a 78-year-old pastor processing a sentence that contained 3 pieces of information, each of which required separate processing. The name Shaquille O'Neal, famous, recognizable, requiring its own category of reaction. The name Joseph Tony, known, filed, associated with a specific set of pastoral memories. And the word father, the heaviest word in the English language, heavier than love, heavier than death, because father contains both and more. "I'll call the facility," Reverend Alston said. "I'll let them know you're coming." Shaq drove to Montclair the next day, October 16, 2024, a Wednesday. He drove the rental Tahoe. He had extended the rental rather than returning it, because flying back to Atlanta and then flying back to New Jersey felt like an interruption. And this process, the search, the finding, the understanding, did not want to be interrupted. It wanted to be continuous. It wanted the same unbroken thread of attention that Philip had given it when he drove to Emporia in 1984. 5 hours, alone, no interruption, the road and the destination and nothing in between. Holly Glen Care Center was a single-story brick building on Valley Road in Montclair. It was clean. It was well maintained. It had a courtyard with a fountain that wasn't running because it was October, and the fountain had been shut off for the season. A small circle of dry stone surrounded by empty benches. A garden that was waiting for spring the way the patients inside were waiting for something. Recovery, visitors, the specific kind of attention that elderly people in care facilities need and rarely receive enough of. Vivica Tony Banks was in room 117. She was 81 years old. She was sitting in a wheelchair by the window. The left side of her face, the stroke side, was slack, the muscles having surrendered their tension, the way a rope surrenders its tautness when it's cut. Her left hand rested in her lap, curled slightly, the fingers in a permanent half-fist. Her right side was functional. Her right eye tracked. Her right hand moved. Her speech was impaired but intelligible. The words came slowly, formed with effort, pushed through a mouth that was working at half capacity. She recognized Shaq immediately, not because of the fame, because of the face. "You look like him," she said. The words were thick, effortful, pushed through the stroke's wreckage, like plants pushing through concrete. "You look like my brother." Shaq sat down. The visitor's chair was small. Nursing home chairs are designed for average-sized visitors, and Shaq had never been average-sized. He sat on the edge, his knees higher than his hips, his back hunched, his body folded into the kind of compact, self-minimizing posture that large men adopt when they're trying to be smaller, when the situation calls for intimacy rather than presence. "Miss Vivica," he said, "I'm trying to find Joseph. I'm trying to find my father." The right side of Vivica's face did something that the left side could not. It crumpled. The eyebrow drew down. The corner of the mouth pulled toward the chin. The eye filled with a liquid that caught the afternoon light coming through the window and refracted it into a tiny, prismatic spectrum. The physics of grief, the optics of tears. "Joseph's gone, baby," she said. The word "gone" arrived at Shaq's ears and traveled inward. Past the tympanic membrane, past the ossicles, past the cochlea, through the auditory nerve to the temporal lobe, and from there to wherever in the brain the word "gone" is processed when it refers to a parent, which is everywhere. The word "gone," when applied to a father, even an absent father, even a father you never knew, even a father who existed only as a hole in your life and 47 letters on a windowsill that you would never read. The word "gone" does not land in one place. It lands everywhere. It is absorbed by the entire system, every organ, every cell, every memory and non-memory and imagined memory and wished-for memory. All of it receives the word and is changed by it. "When?" Shaq asked. 2004. June the 9th, in that room he lived in Virginia, 20 years ago. Shaq had been 32. He had just won his 4th NBA championship with the Miami Heat, alongside Dwyane Wade, the culmination of a trade from the Lakers that had been one of the most seismic transactions in sports history. In June 2004, Shaq was preparing for the trade that would take him from Los Angeles to Miami. He was negotiating. He was strategizing. He was managing the politics of professional basketball. the egos and contracts and media narratives that constitute the business behind the game. In June 2004, while Shaq was negotiating his future, Joseph Tony was dying alone in a room above a hardware store in Emporia, Virginia. 54 years old, heart failure. The coroner's report, which Vivica had received by mail 3 weeks after the death, because she was listed as next of kin on a form that Joseph had apparently filled out at some point. A form that required the name of someone who would be notified when the form filler died. And Joseph had written his sister's name because he had no one else to write. The coroner's report listed the cause as congestive heart failure and the manner as natural. As if there were anything natural about a 54-year-old man dying alone in a rented room with no family present and no one to hold his hand and no one to say the things that people say to dying people, the lies and the truths and the hybrid lie truths that constitute the language of deathbeds. It's okay. You can go. I'm here. You're not alone. The words that serve no medical function and every human function. The words that Joseph did not hear because there was no one in the room to say them. Who found him? Shaq asked. The landlord. 3 days later, he missed the rent. 3 days. Joseph Tony lay in his room above a hardware store for 3 days before anyone noticed he was gone. 3 days during which the world continued. The hardware store opened and closed. Customers bought nails and paint and lumber. The sun rose and set. The chickens at the processing plant were processed by someone else because Joseph was no longer there to process them. And the room above the store held its occupant the way rooms hold everything. Silently, without judgment, without the ability to call for help. The funeral? Shaq asked. Wasn't much of one. I drove down from East Orange, me and Reverend Alston. Joseph didn't have people. Not anymore. The church paid for the burial. A plot in the municipal cemetery, Greensville Memorial, outside Emporia. She paused. The stroke made pauses involuntary. The neural pathways that controlled speech were damaged. And sometimes the signals simply stopped. The way a train stops between stations, not because it's arrived, but because the track ahead is broken. She waited for the words to find their way through the wreckage. He didn't have much. The room, the landlord cleared it out, threw most of it away. There was a shelf with some books, a Bible, a phone directory for Newark that was years out of date, and letters. Shaq's chest tightened. On the windowsill, Vivica continued, a stack of letters. I don't know how many. The landlord said he threw them out. He didn't know what they were. He said they were just addressed to someone. Addressed to me, Shaq said. Vivica looked at him. Her right eye, the working eye, the eye that still carried the full weight of sight and expression, and the ability to communicate what the mouth could not. That eye held him the way an old woman's eye holds a young man who has just said something that confirms a truth she has known for decades, but has never spoken. You know about the letters, she said. Philip, my stepfather, told me. In a letter he wrote 30 years ago. He went to Emporia in 1984. He saw the room. He saw the letters. Philip went to see Joseph? Yes. Vivica's right hand lifted from her lap, moved to her face, touched her cheek. The right cheek, the working cheek, the one that could still feel the pressure of her own fingers. The gesture was self-comforting. The gesture of a woman who is receiving information that rearranges something inside her. A belief, a grudge, a filed and closed assessment of a man she thought she understood. I didn't know that, she said. I didn't know Philip went to see him. Nobody knew. He never told anyone. Why? Shaq looked at the window, at the courtyard with the dry fountain, at the empty benches waiting for visitors who might or might not come. Because he was protecting me, Shaq said. He was protecting me from knowing that Joseph, that my father, had been trying to reach me, that he'd been writing to me, that he was living in a room with one pot and one plate and dreaming about feeding me a meal. Vivica's eye filled again. The tears spilled down the right cheek, the working cheek, the side that could still cry. The left side of her face remained still, locked in the stroke's paralysis, unable to participate in the grief that the right side was expressing. A face divided, half weeping, half frozen, the cruelest geometry. He talked about you, Vivica said. Every time I visit, and I didn't visit enough, I know I didn't visit enough, Lord knows. Every time, he talked about you, not about the basketball. He didn't care about the basketball. He talked about she stopped, not a stroke pause, a choice pause. The pause of a woman deciding whether to release something that has been inside her for 20 years. He talked about cooking for you. He'd describe the meal, every time, a different meal. One time it was fried chicken and collard greens. One time it was gumbo, our mama's gumbo recipe, the one from Baton Rouge, before the family moved to Newark. One time it was just eggs, scrambled eggs and toast. He said scrambled eggs were the first thing he ever learned to cook, and he wanted to teach you. She looked at Shaq. He'd describe the table. Where you'd sit, where he'd sit, what he'd say to you when you came in. He'd say, I'd tell him, sit down, son, I made this for you. That's what he'd say, every time. Sit down, son. I made this for you. Sit down, son. I made this for you. 8 words. 8 words that Joseph Toney rehearsed in a rented room for years. 8 words that he polished and repeated and carried the way a soldier carries a prayer, not because the words had power, but because the saying of them was a practice, a discipline, a refusal to let go of the future he wanted, even as the present made that future impossible. Sit down, son. I made this for you. The meal that was never cooked, the table that was never set, the father and son who never sat across from each other. The 8 words that were spoken only to empty air, to the walls of a room above a hardware store, to a sister who visited but not enough, to the silence that grew louder every year until it was louder than everything else. And then there was only the silence because Joseph's heart, which had been carrying the weight of those 8 words for decades, finally failed under the load. Shaq sat in the visitor's chair in room 117 at Holly Glen Care Center and listened to Vivica describe a man he had never known. Not the man who left. Not the villain of his childhood narrative. Not the absence that Philip had filled with discipline and presence and the relentless, exhausting, thankless work of being enough. A different man. A man who cooked imaginary meals for a son he couldn't face. A man who wrote 47 letters and sealed them and stamped them and addressed them and placed them on a windowsill where the morning light would catch them every day. A daily reminder of everything he wanted to say and couldn't. A man who processed 1,000 chickens a day at a plant that turned living things into products, and who came home to a room where he dreamed about a single chicken. A chicken he would season himself. A chicken he would cook himself. A chicken he would serve to his son at a table he would set himself. A chicken that would be, in its humble, ordinary, unspectacular way, the most important meal ever prepared by any father in the history of fatherhood. Because the meal was not about the food. The meal was about the table. And the table was about the sitting. And the sitting was about the presence. And the presence was what Joseph Toney could not provide, and what Philip Harrison provided instead, and what the 47 letters tried to bridge, and what the 3 words carved into the bottom of a footlocker tried to command, and what a 30-year-old letter sealed in an envelope tried to explain, and what a 52-year-old man sitting in a nursing home in Montclair, New Jersey, was only now, 20 years after his biological father died alone in a room above a hardware store, beginning to understand. The letters, Shaq said, the ones the landlord threw away. Is there any chance? They're gone, baby, Vivica said. He threw them out with the rest, the clothes, the books, the hot plate, all of it went to the dump 20 years ago, gone. 47 letters written over years across cities, in rented rooms and bus stations and the break rooms of processing plants. 47 letters that contained, what? Words, descriptions of imaginary meals, apologies, explanations. The desperate, impossible, unsendable attempt of a man who had nothing to offer something anyway, even if the offering was only ink on paper, even if the paper never traveled, even if the words lived and died on a windowsill in Emporia, Virginia, and were thrown into a dumpster by a landlord who was clearing a room so he could rent it to the next person who had nowhere else to go. Gone 47 chances to know his father. 47 windows into the mind of a man who loved him from a distance so great that the love arrived at its destination decades late and only through the mediation of 2 other men. A stepfather who drove to Virginia and a pastor who called a nursing home. Gone. And Shaq would never read them, would never know what Joseph wrote, would never see his father's handwriting, would never learn whether the handwriting was careful or careless, whether the letters were long or short, whether the vocabulary was simple or complex, whether the spelling was perfect or imperfect. All of the tiny, telling, irreplaceable details that a person's handwriting reveals about their inner life, the way a person's walk reveals their confidence, and a person's laugh reveals their joy. The letters were in a landfill, decomposing, returning to the earth. The ink dissolving into the paper dissolving into the soil, the words dissolving into nothing. The final chemical undoing of a father's love, broken down by microorganisms and weather, and the impersonal processes of decay into elements that carried no meaning, no memory, no trace of a man named Joseph Tony, who wanted to cook scrambled eggs for his son. Shaq thanked Vivica. He held her right hand, her working hand, the hand that could feel his grip and return it. Her fingers were thin. The skin was papery. The hand was 81 years old, and it had held Joseph's hand at the funeral. The only funeral, the small funeral, the funeral attended by a sister and a pastor, and no one else. He would have liked you, Vivica said, not because of the basketball, because of the size. He was small. Did you know that, 5'9"? Your height came from your mama's side. Joseph was small, and he always said, if I'd been bigger, maybe I could have held on. Maybe I could have stayed. Maybe I could have been big enough to carry it. Big enough to carry it. The hunger, the shame, the distance between who he was and who he wanted to be. The gap between a rented room and a kitchen table. The weight of 47 unsent letters and a dream about scrambled eggs. He wasn't big enough, but his son was. Shaq left the nursing home at 4:30 p.m. He drove south, not toward the airport, not toward Atlanta, south, toward Virginia, toward Emporia, toward a municipal cemetery called Greensville Memorial, on the outskirts of a small town where his father had lived and worked and dreamed and died. He drove 5 hours, the same drive Philip had made in 1984, the same road, the same direction, the same pilgrimage, a son following a stepfather following a biological father, 3 men connected by a boy who was now a giant, a chain of fatherhood that stretched from Baton Rouge to Newark to Emporia to Atlanta, each link forged by a different kind of love and a different kind of failure, and the same unifying, inescapable hunger. He arrived at Greensville Memorial Cemetery at 9:47 p.m. The cemetery was closed, the gate was locked. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, modest, functional, the kind of fence that says boundary without saying fortress. The headstones were visible in the dark, pale shapes scattered across a flat, grassy field, each one marking the place where a person stopped moving and became permanent. Shaq parked the Tahoe outside the gate. He got out. He stood at the fence for a long time, looking at the headstones, not knowing which one was Joseph's, not knowing if Joseph's was even visible from here. Municipal cemeteries assign plots based on availability, and the available plots are often in the back, in the sections that visitors don't see from the road, in the parts of the cemetery where the grass is less maintained, and the flowers are less frequent, and the dead are less visited. He would come back in the morning. He slept in the Tahoe, in the parking lot of the cemetery. Not because there were no hotels in Emporia. There were, a few, the modest highway-adjacent lodging that small towns provide for travelers who are passing through. But Shaq did not want to pass through. He wanted to be here, at the gate, as close to Joseph as he could get without crossing the fence. He slept sitting up. The driver's seat reclined as far as it could go, which was not far enough. It never was, in any vehicle, the recline mechanism designed for a body that ended at 6 feet, not 7'1". His knees pressed against the steering column. His neck was at an angle that would produce complaints in the morning. The October night was cold, mid-40s, the kind of Virginia autumn cold that gets into a car through the seams and the vents and the gaps between the doors, the kind of cold that a heated seat can't fully defeat. He didn't care. He had slept in worse. He had slept on buses during college at LSU. Long road trips to SEC away games, the bus seats even less accommodating than the Tahoe, His body folded into impossible configurations while his teammates slept normally in seats designed for normal bodies. He had slept on planes. He had slept in locker rooms. He had slept standing up during basic training. Not his own basic training, but Philip's, described in such vivid detail during Shaq's childhood that the stories had become a form of shared experience and inherited discomfort. A second-hand exhaustion that Shaq carried in his body the way he carried the shrapnel in Philip's leg. Not physically, but sympathetically. He slept. Briefly. He woke at 6:12 a.m., the cemetery opened at 7. He waited. The sky lightened. The October dawn. Soft, gray, gradual. The kind of dawn that doesn't announce itself with color, but with the slow subtraction of darkness. The world becoming visible one shade at a time. At 7, a groundskeeper arrived. An older man in a green jacket, driving a riding mower that he parked near the maintenance shed. He unlocked the gate. He noticed the Tahoe. He noticed the man inside the Tahoe. He noticed the size of the man inside the Tahoe. "Can I help you?" the groundskeeper asked. His name tag said Earl. "I'm looking for a grave," Shaq said. "Joseph Tony. Buried here in 2004. Earl consulted a ledger. A physical ledger. A bound book of handwritten entries, the analog record of every burial in Greensville Memorial Cemetery since 1962. Municipal cemeteries in small Virginia towns do not have digital databases. They have Earl. They have ledgers. They have the institutional memory of a man who has been mowing the grass and digging the holes and maintaining the grounds for. In Earl's case, 27 years. "Tony," Earl said, running his finger down a column of names. "Tony, Joseph A. June 2004. Section G, row 14. Plot 7. Section G was in the back, where Shaq suspected it would be. He walked there. Past the front sections. Section A, Section B, where the headstones were larger, more ornate. Some with photographs embedded in granite. Some with flowers that were fresh. Some with American flags that indicated veterans. Past the middle sections. C, D, E, where the headstones were modest but maintained, where families still visited, where the grass was trimmed close, and the plots were tended with the loving, routine attention that the living give to the dead when the dead are still remembered. Section G was different. Section G was the section where the headstones were smallest, where the grass was longer, not neglected but less prioritized, the mowing schedule less frequent, the attention less granular, where the plots were marked not with granite monuments but with flat markers, bronze plaques set flush with the earth, level with the grass, visible only if you were standing directly above them and looking straight down. The cheapest option. The option that municipal cemeteries provide for burials, funded by charity or by the state or by a sister who drove down from East Orange and paid what she could, which was not much, because Vivica Tony Banks was a retired cafeteria worker with a pension that covered rent and medication and not much else. Row 14, plot 7. Shaq found it. A flat bronze plaque, 12 inches by 18 inches, set into the earth. The grass had grown over the edges, blurring the boundary between the marker and the ground. The way time blurs the boundary between the remembered and the forgotten. The plaque read Joseph A. Tony Nov 29, 1949, June 9, 2004 at rest 2 dates. A name, 2 words at rest, no epitaph, no scripture, no beloved father or in God's hands or any of the phrases that families choose to inscribe on the markers of people who mattered to them. The final public statement about a life, the last words that the living assign to the dead, the epitaph that is supposed to compress an entire existence into a phrase that fits on bronze. At rest, the minimum, the default. The words that the cemetery puts on the plaque when nobody provides an alternative. Shaq knelt. His knees touched the grass. The morning dew soaked through his jeans. The cold, wet seep of Virginia autumn. The ground releasing the moisture it had accumulated overnight. The earth giving back what the air had given it. His knees were in the dirt of Greensville Memorial Cemetery in Emporia, Virginia, and his hands were on the plaque, and his fingers were tracing the letters of a name he had spent 52 years refusing to speak and 5 days learning to say differently. Joseph A. Tony, his father. The man who left, the man who couldn't stay. The man who processed 1,000 chickens a day and couldn't feed his own son. The man who wrote 47 letters and sealed them, and stamped them, and placed them on a windowsill, and never sent them because he had nothing to offer. Nothing except words and a dream about a meal, and 8 words rehearsed to empty air. "Sit down, son. I made this for you." Shaq knelt at the grave and he did something he had never done for Joseph Tony. He spoke to him, not the way people speak to graves in movies, dramatically, with music swelling, with the camera pulling back to reveal the lonely figure in the vast cemetery. He spoke the way a person speaks to another person who is in the room but facing away, quietly, directly, without performance. "I got your message," he said. "It took a while. It went through Philip, but I got it." The grass was still. The morning was silent, except for the distant sound of Earl's riding mower starting up in Section A, the mechanical rumble of maintenance, the sound of a living world continuing to function around a conversation between a living man and a dead one. "I know about the room. I know about the letters. I know about the hot plate and the one plate and the one fork. I know about the chicken plant. I know you wanted to cook for me." His voice was steady, the Philip kind of steady, the forcibly steady. The bridge bearing more weight than its engineers planned for. "I'm going to build you a table," Shaq said. "Not for you and me. It's too late for that. I know it's too late. But for the next father. The next man sitting in a room with nothing, dreaming about a meal he can't make. I'm going to build him a table. And I'm going to put food on it. And I'm going to let him sit across from his kid and say the words." He paused. "Your words. Sit down, son. I made this for you." He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the second envelope. One Philip had written to Joseph and never sent. The letter that said, "I went to Emporia. I saw the room. I saw the letters. I understand now." He placed it on the grave, on the bronze plaque, directly on the name. A letter that was 30 years late, from one father to another, delivered by the son they shared, the boy who was fed by both of them, in different ways, from different distances, with different kinds of love that looked nothing alike, and were, underneath all the distance and silence and unsent envelopes, the same thing. The same hunger, the same table, the same dream. "Sit down, son. I made this for you." Shaq drove back to Atlanta on October 17, 2024. He drove the full distance, 9 hours. Emporia to Richmond on Route 58, Richmond to Raleigh on I-85, Raleigh to Charlotte to Greenville to Atlanta on I-85 South. 9 hours of highway, 9 hours of asphalt and guardrails, and the rhythmic thump of expansion joints passing beneath tires at 72 miles per hour. 9 hours of a man inside a rented Tahoe that smelled like cemetery grass and October cold, and the specific, unnameable scent that clings to a person who has knelt at a grave and spoken to someone who cannot answer. He didn't listen to music, he didn't listen to podcasts, he didn't call anyone. He drove in silence. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to think about, but the silence of a man who has too much to think about and who needs the silence the way a dark room needs darkness, to develop, to let the image emerge, to allow the thing that has been exposed to light. The letter, the footlocker, the room, the grave, the 47 letters in a landfill, the 8 words rehearsed to empty air, to resolve into a picture that can be seen and understood and acted upon. By the time he crossed the Georgia state line, the picture was clear. He called Renata from the car. It was 5:47 p.m. She answered on the first ring. She had been waiting for this call for 3 days. 3 days during which she had spoken to Griffin Sow, the M&A attorney, 11 times. During which she had fielded calls from the Five Guys corporate office, which had heard rumors about a potential liquidation and was, in the diplomatic language of franchise relations, seeking clarification. During which she had run financial models and tax simulations and scenario analyses, because Renata Solano Vickers did not wait passively. She prepared. She built structures around uncertainty the way an engineer builds levees around a flood plain. Not to stop the water, but to direct it. To give it somewhere to go that wasn't catastrophic. "I'm ready to explain," Shaq said. He explained. He told Renata about the footlocker, about the letter, about Philip's confession, and the drive to Emporia and Joseph Tony, and the room above the hardware store. He told her about the 47 letters and the hot plate and the one plate and the one fork. He told her about Vivica and the nursing home and the stroke and the meals that Joseph described to his sister, the imaginary dinners, the rehearsed greetings. "Sit down. Son, I made this for you." He told her about the grave in Section G, Row 14, Plot 7, with the flat bronze plaque that said "At rest" because nobody had provided an alternative. He told her about the hunger. Renata listened. She listened the way she did everything, with total attention, without interruption, her mind simultaneously processing the emotional content and the financial implications, because Renata's brain operated on dual tracks. Track 1 was human. This is devastating. This is beautiful. This man is grieving and discovering and rearranging himself in real time. Track 2 was professional. What are the tax consequences of a $180 million asset liquidation? What are the capital gains implications? What is the timeline? What is the structure? Both tracks ran simultaneously. Neither canceled the other. This was Renata's gift. The ability to care deeply and calculate precisely at the same time, the way a surgeon cares about the patient and calculates the incision simultaneously, because caring without precision is sentiment, and precision without caring is cruelty, and neither one alone is sufficient. When Shaq finished, Renata was quiet for 10 seconds. 10 seconds was an eternity in Renata time. Renata operated at the speed of decision. She processed information and produced conclusions the way a machine processes inputs and produces outputs, rapidly, reliably, with a latency that approached zero. 10 seconds of silence meant the machine was processing something that didn't fit its usual parameters. Something that required a new algorithm. Something that was not a financial problem masquerading as an emotional one, but an emotional problem with financial consequences, which was different, which was rarer, which required a different kind of processing entirely. "Okay," Renata said, "let me make sure I understand. You want to sell the entire restaurant portfolio. 155 Five Guys, 9 Papa John's, 17 Auntie Anne's, the Krispy Kreme Holdings and Big Chicken, and use the proceeds to fund a hunger relief program." "Yes, a program focused specifically on communal dining spaces in food banks. Tables, not food lines. Tables. And you want to call it Harrison's table?" "Yes, after Philip, after both of them." Renata paused again. 3 seconds this time. Shorter. The machine was recalibrating. "Both of them," she repeated. Philip stayed. Joseph dreamed. The table needs both. It needs the man who shows up and the man who imagines the meal. It needs the discipline and the hunger. It needs— He stopped, swallowed. The sound was audible over the phone. The sound of a man whose throat was constricting around something too large for the passage. Something that was trying to move from his chest to his mouth, and that was bigger than the architecture of speech could accommodate. "It needs a place where a father can sit across from his kid and say 8 words, Shaq said. 8 words that my father, my biological father, rehearsed in a room for years and never got to say to me. 'Sit down, son. I made this for you. That's what the table is. That's what all of this is.'" Renata was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she said, "I'll start the calls tonight." The liquidation took 11 weeks. 11 weeks to dismantle a restaurant empire that had taken over a decade to build. 11 weeks of calls and meetings and negotiations and the grinding, complex, endlessly documented machinery of American franchise law. Griffin Sau worked 18-hour days. His team, 4 associates and a paralegal named Suki, who consumed more coffee per hour than most people consume per week, and who maintained a spreadsheet tracking every franchise agreement across 4 states with the meticulous precision of a person for whom spreadsheets are not tools but art forms. His team processed 203 separate transactions. Each franchise location required individual negotiations. The Five Guys locations were the most complex. 155 separate franchise agreements, each one a legal entity with its own lease, its own employees, its own local regulatory obligations, its own relationship with the community it served. You don't close 155 restaurants without affecting thousands of people: the managers, the line cooks, the cashiers, the delivery drivers, the landlords, the supply chain vendors, the customers who come every Thursday for a bacon cheeseburger because Thursday is their bacon cheeseburger day, And the ritual of it is what holds their week together. Shaq insisted on one condition that made the liquidation slower and more expensive than it needed to be. Every employee would be offered placement. No one would lose their job. The buyers, a combination of existing franchisees, investment groups, and individual operators who had been waiting for an opportunity to enter the Five Guys system, would be contractually required to retain existing staff for a minimum of 6 months at current wages. Griffin told Shaq this condition would reduce the sale price by an estimated $8 to $12 million, because buyers pay less when they inherit labor obligations. "I don't care," Shaq said. "Shaq, that's $12 million. I don't care. These people work for me. They've been showing up every day, making food, serving customers, cleaning grills. They've been feeding people. I'm not going to take their jobs to save $12 million. My father processed 1,000 chickens a day for minimum wage. I know what it means to work a food job. Nobody loses their job. Nobody lost their job. The Papa John's locations sold in 3 weeks, the fastest segment of the liquidation, because Papa John's corporate had a waiting list of qualified franchisees, and the transfer process was standardized. The Auntie Anne's sold in 5 weeks. The Krispy Kreme holdings were absorbed by an existing operator in the Southeast region. Big Chicken took the longest. Big Chicken was personal. Big Chicken was the brand Shaq had built from nothing. From a conversation with a chef named Matt Silverman at a food festival in Las Vegas in 2017, from a napkin sketch of a chicken sandwich that was Shaq-sized, like comically big, like you pick it up and you're holding a pillow made of chicken. From a lease on South Las Vegas Boulevard, and a construction timeline and a menu that included items named after Shaq's family. The Lucille's Mac and Cheese, the MDE, most dominant ever sandwich, the Uncle Jerome's chicken tenders. Selling Big Chicken felt like selling a piece of himself, a piece of Lucille, a piece of the family mythology that he'd built into a brand and served to strangers through a window on the Las Vegas Strip. But Philip's letter was clear. And clarity, once achieved, does not negotiate. Build something that feeds people. Not customers, people, Big Chicken-fed customers. Customers paid $14.99 for a sandwich and $6.99 for a side and $3.49 for a drink, and the total was processed, and the receipt was printed, and the food was consumed. The customer left and another customer arrived, and the cycle continued with the same mechanical efficiency that Bud Harrison brought to the lumber mill, and Joseph Toney brought to the chicken plant, and that Philip Harrison recognized, in his letter, as the hunger eating itself, consumption disguised as nourishment, accumulation disguised as generosity, the building of 1,000 tables at which no father ever sat across from his son and said the 8 words. Big Chicken sold on December 23, 2024. The buyer was a hospitality group based in Houston. The sale price was $22 million, lower than Renata's initial valuation, because the buyer knew Shaq was motivated and because motivated sellers get less. That's the math. That's the market. The market does not care about footlockers or fathers or letters carved into wood. The total liquidation. All restaurants, all brands, all franchise agreements netted approximately $168 million after taxes, legal fees, broker commissions, and the employee retention obligations that cost $11.4 million, but that Shaq never regretted for a single second. $168 million, a fortune built on hunger, about to be converted into tables. Shaq's team began assembling the infrastructure for Harrison's table in January 2025. The team was small, deliberately small, because Shaq had learned from his foundation work and from Philip, and from the military, and from the basic arithmetic truth of organizations that efficiency decreases as headcount increases. More people means more meetings. More meetings means more time talking about the thing instead of doing the thing. Philip Harrison would have put it differently. A squad of 8 beats a platoon of 40 if the 8 know what they're doing. The squad was 8. Renata handled the financial architecture, the nonprofit structure, the 501c3 application, the endowment model. She partnered with a nonprofit attorney in Washington, D.C. named Vivian Okafor Briggs. who had structured charitable entities for 3 former presidents and who approached tax-exempt organizations with the same rigor that she approached everything else, as problems that required elegant solutions, not just legal ones. The programmatic design, the actual question of what does Harrison's table look like inside a food bank, was led by a woman named Coretta Sparks. Coretta was 39 years old. She had spent 14 years working in hunger relief, first at the Atlanta Community Food Bank, then at the Greater Chicago Food Depository, then at the national level with Feeding America, the largest hunger relief organization in the United States. Feeding America operates a network of 200 food banks and 60,000 food pantries serving over 46 million Americans annually. A number so large that it becomes abstract, that exceeds the brain's capacity for empathy, that requires translation into something smaller, something human-scaled, before it can be felt. Coretta could translate. She had spent her career translating the statistics of hunger into the experience of hunger, the specific, bodily, emotionally devastating experience of being a parent who opens a refrigerator and sees nothing and turns around and sees a child looking at you with an expression that asks a question the child doesn't have words for yet, but that every parent understands. Is there food? The answer for 44 million Americans who experience food insecurity, defined by the USDA as a household-level economic and social condition of limited or uncertain access to adequate food, the answer, on any given day, is not enough, or not the right kind, or yes, but only because I skipped my own meal, or yes, but only because I went to the food bank, which means I stood in a line and carried a bag and walked past people I know from church, or from work, or from my kids' school, and hoped they didn't see me, and they hoped I didn't see them, and the mutual not seeing was its own kind of hunger, the hunger for dignity. This was the problem that Coretta understood, and that Shaq wanted to solve. Not the food problem. The food problem was being addressed. Imperfectly, insufficiently, but addressed by the existing infrastructure of food banks and pantries and government programs. SNAP, WIC, school lunch programs, the National School Breakfast Program, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, a patchwork of federal, state, local, and nonprofit initiatives that collectively fed millions of people, and that collectively failed millions of others, and that, almost universally, did so without dignity. Because the architecture of hunger relief in America was designed for efficiency, not dignity. Food banks distribute food, they do it well. They source food from donations, from USDA commodity programs, from retail partners who contribute surplus inventory, and they distribute it to pantries and shelters and community organizations which distribute it to individuals and families. The supply chain is functional. The logistics are sound. The food reaches people. But the experience of receiving the food is. And Coretta had spent 14 years thinking about how to say this precisely, how to name the thing that most hunger relief professionals know but rarely articulate. The experience is transactional. You stand in a line, you present identification, you receive a bag or a box, you take it home, you eat. You come back next week and do it again. There is no table, there is no sitting down. There is no meal prepared by someone and served to you and eaten in the presence of other people with whom you share the experience of being human and hungry and alive. There is no father sitting across from a son. There is no sit down, I made this for you. There is a line and a bag and a transaction and the peculiar corrosive daily shame of being a person who cannot feed yourself in a country that produces enough food to feed the world twice over. The shame was what Coretta wanted to eliminate. The shame was what Shaq wanted to eliminate. The shame was what Philip Harrison's letter was about. The shame of Joseph Toney, who had nothing to offer his son, whose shame metastasized into absence, whose absence became its own kind of hunger, which became its own kind of inheritance, which passed from generation to generation like a gene, like a curse, like a debt that compounds interest until the principal is unrecognizable. Harrison's table was designed to break the cycle. Not a food bank, not a pantry, not a distribution center. A table. A physical, actual wooden table inside a food bank where families could sit together and eat a prepared meal. A meal cooked by a chef, served on real plates. Not plastic, not styrofoam, not the disposable architecture of poverty, eaten with real utensils at a real table with real chairs. The design was specific because specificity matters. The tables were communal, long, rectangular, built to seat 12. Not round tables, which create intimacy but also create enclosure, a closed circle that excludes anyone standing outside it. Long tables, open tables, tables where a family of 3 sits next to a family of 5 sits next to a man alone, and the proximity, the shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, past the salt please proximity of shared space, creates something that no food bag can create. Community. The meals were simple. This was Shaq's insistence, and it was rooted in the letter. In Philip's description of Joseph's imagined dinners, which were never elaborate. Scrambled eggs and toast, fried chicken and collard greens, gumbo from a recipe that originated in Baton Rouge and traveled through generations the way recipes travel. Not on paper but in hands, in the muscle memory of stirring and seasoning, in the inherited knowledge of how long to cook the roux before it turns from blonde to brown to the dark mahogany, almost burnt alchemy that gives gumbo its depth. Simple food, real food. Food that a father could have made if he'd had a kitchen and the ingredients and the chance. The partnership with Feeding America was announced on February 14, 2025, Valentine's Day. The anniversary of the day Shaq walked into a billing office at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and placed a black card on a counter. The date was not a coincidence. Shaq didn't believe in coincidences anymore, he believed in circles. He believed that the things you do come back, not as karma, not as cosmic justice, but as geometry, lines that curve, paths that bend, trajectories that appear to be straight, but that are, over long enough distances, circular. The donation was $50 million, the single largest individual donation in the history of Feeding America. Larger than any corporate gift, larger than any foundation grant. $50 million from the proceeds of a restaurant empire that a man sold because his dead father told him to, which is a sentence that sounds insane until you know the story, and then it sounds like the sanest thing anyone has ever done. The remaining $118 million went into an endowment, managed by Renata, invested conservatively, designed to generate approximately $5 million per year in perpetuity. The endowment would fund the ongoing operations of Harrison's Table locations across the country. The chef's salaries, the food costs, the real plates and real utensils, the tables themselves, the chairs, the dignified, intentional, shame-eliminating infrastructure of a meal served with care. The first Harrison's Table opened on March 6, 2025, Shaq's 53rd birthday. The location was the Community Food Bank of New Jersey, on Front Street in Hillside, New Jersey, 11 miles from the storage unit on Hawthorne Avenue, where Lucille found the Foot Locker, 14 miles from Bergen Street in Newark, where Alton Tony's Barbershop, Tony's Cuts, 3 chairs, opened since 1958, burned during the Newark riots of July 1967, and was never rebuilt and was never insured, and was the first domino in a chain of falling that led from a barber's broken dream to a son who stopped being a father to a grandson, who processed chickens to a great-grandson, who played basketball to a letter in a Foot Locker to a table in a food bank. 62 years. From the fire to the table. The distance was not measured in miles. It was measured in meals that were never served, in tables that were never set, in fathers who were never able to say 8 words to their sons. The Community Food Bank of New Jersey occupies a 285,000 square foot warehouse that distributes over 80 million pounds of food annually to more than 800 community partners across New Jersey. It is one of the largest food banks in the country. It serves a region where approximately 1 in 9 residents, over 1 million people, experience food insecurity. The numbers are vast, and the warehouse is vast, and the operation is vast, and the vastness is necessary because the hunger is vast. But Harrison's Table was not vast. Harrison's Table was small, deliberately, intentionally, because Philip Harrison's letter was not about scale. It was about proximity. It was about the distance between 2 people sitting across from each other at a table. The 3 feet of wood and air and eye contact that separates a father from a son, a mother from a daughter, a person from a person. 3 feet. That was the distance that mattered. The table was built by a furniture maker named Solomon Achibi. Solomon was 44 years old. He was born in Lagos, Nigeria. He immigrated to the United States in 2009. He settled in Newark, in the Ironbound district, the neighborhood east of Penn Station, where Portuguese, Brazilian, Spanish, and West African communities exist in the dense, aromatic, multilingual tapestry that defines immigrant Newark. He opened a furniture workshop in a garage on Pacific Street. He built tables, chairs, shelving, custom pieces commissioned by restaurants and offices and homes that wanted something handmade, something touched by human hands rather than stamped by machines. He had also, for the past 3 years, been feeding his own family through the Community Food Bank of New Jersey. Business was inconsistent. Custom furniture is a luxury market, and luxury markets contract during economic downturns. And the downturns had been frequent enough and deep enough that Solomon's income swung between sustainable and desperate on a cycle that he could not predict and could not control. In the good months, he paid rent and bought groceries and put gas in the van and set aside a small amount, $50, sometimes $100, in an envelope he kept in his workshop, labeled School in Sharpie. Because Solomon's daughter, Adiezi, was 11 years old and Solomon was already saving for her education the way his father had saved for his. Slowly, painfully, dollar by dollar, with the faith that small deposits over enough time become sufficient. In the bad months, the envelope stayed flat. In the worst months, Solomon opened the envelope and took money out. $20 for electricity, $30 for Adaizi's school supplies, and the taking out felt like a wound, a self-inflicted wound. The specific, private, corrosive pain of a man who is cannibalizing his daughter's future to fund her present. In the worst months, Solomon went to the food bank. He went early, 6 a.m. before the line formed, before the other families arrived. Because Solomon did not want to be seen. Not because he was ashamed of needing help. He understood intellectually that food insecurity is an economic condition, not a moral failing. But intellectual understanding and emotional experience are different countries. And Solomon lived in the emotional one, where a man who cannot feed his family is a man who has failed the most basic test of fatherhood. And the failure follows him home and sits at his table, at his empty table, at his table with not enough on it, and stares at him with the eyes of an 11-year-old girl who trusts him completely, and whose trust feels, in the bad months, like a weight he is not strong enough to carry. When Jerome Crawford contacted the Community Food Bank of New Jersey about installing the first Harrison's table, the food bank's director, a woman named Patrice Underwood Ellis, who had run the operation for 9 years and who processed more food per year than most grocery store chains, mentioned Solomon. "We have a furniture maker who uses our services," Patrice said. "He's talented, he's struggling. If you're looking for someone to build the tables, he could use the work." Jerome called Solomon, explained the project, explained the concept. Communal tables, long, rectangular, seating 12, built from reclaimed wood, built by hands that understood what it meant to be hungry. Solomon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You want me to build a table for people like me?" "Yes. A table where they can eat with their families." "Yes. A real table. Not a folding table, not plastic, real wood joints, finish. The kind of table that says to the person sitting at it, 'You matter.'" Exactly. Solomon built the table in his garage on Pacific Street. He built it from reclaimed oak, wood salvaged from a demolished church in Irvington, New Jersey. A church that had closed in 2019 after 93 years of service. Its congregation dwindled, its roof leaking, its future foreclosed. The wood was old. The wood had held pews where people sat and prayed and grieved and celebrated for nearly a century. The wood had absorbed the weight of human bodies and the sound of human voices and the vibration of hymns sung in keys that ranged from grief to joy and back again. Solomon built the table from that wood. He built it over 3 weeks. He worked at night, after the custom orders were filled, after Adiezi was in bed, after the workshop was quiet, and the only sound was the scrape of the hand plane and the whisper of sandpaper and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to new shapes. He joined the boards with mortise and tenon joints, the oldest, strongest joinery method, used by Egyptian carpenters 5,000 years ago, a method that requires no nails and no screws and no glue, only the precise cutting of a projection, the tenon, that fits into a hole, the mortise, and holds by friction and geometry alone. A joint that holds because of how it's made, not because of what's added to it. He finished the table on March 3, 2025. The date meant nothing to Solomon. He didn't know it was the anniversary of the day Philip Harrison wrote the letter. He didn't know that 31 years earlier, to the day, a staff sergeant at Fort Stewart, Georgia, had sat at a desk and written 6 pages of blue ballpoint pen on yellow legal paper and sealed them in an envelope and locked them in a footlocker with a combination that was his son's birthday. March 3, the day the words were written. March 3, the day the table was finished. The wood didn't know either, but wood holds, wood remembers. And if you believe, as Solomon did, as his father in Lagos did, as woodworkers across centuries and continents have believed, that the material carries something of its history into its future, then the table Solomon built from the wood of a demolished church in Irvington carried, in its grain, the residue of 93 years of prayer, 93 years of people asking for help, 93 years of the specific ancient human act of sitting together and believing that the sitting matters. The table was installed at the Community Food Bank of New Jersey on March 5, 2025. One day before the opening. It was 12 feet long, 3 feet wide, 30 inches tall. 12 chairs, also built by Solomon, from the same reclaimed oak, with the same mortise and tenon joints. The table was sanded smooth. The finish was a hand-rubbed oil, not polyurethane, not lacquer, not the plastic, glossy, impervious surfaces that commercial furniture uses to prevent stains and damage. Oil. A finish that soaks into the wood rather than sitting on top of it. A finish that shows use, that darkens where hands rest, that lightens where elbows lean, that records, in its surface, the history of every person who sits there. Solomon wanted the table to show use. He wanted it to age. He wanted the wood to carry the marks of the people who ate at it. The water rings and the scratches and the small, daily damages that accumulate over years, and that transform a piece of furniture from an object into a witness. A table that has been used is a table that has mattered. A table that is pristine is a table that has been protected from the thing it was made for. This table was not made for protection. This table was made for sitting. March 6, 2025, 11 a.m. The Community Food Bank of New Jersey, Hillside, 11 miles from Hawthorne Avenue. The table was set, 12 places. Real plates, white ceramic, the kind you'd find in a diner, heavy, sturdy, the kind of plate that communicates permanence. Real forks, real knives, real spoons, stainless steel, weighty, the kind of utensils that feel like utensils and not like the disposable afterthoughts that most institutional feeding programs provide. Cloth napkins. Blue, because Coretta had asked Shaq if there was a gluffer preference. And Shaq had said blue and hadn't explained why, and didn't need to explain why because the blue was Lucille's blue. The cardigan's blue. The blue of a woman who held a family together for 52 years, and who deserved to have her color at the table even if she wasn't sitting at it. Blue napkins, Lucille's blue. The food was simple, scrambled eggs and toast, not because the kitchen couldn't produce more. The food bank's kitchen was equipped to feed hundreds. The chef, a woman named Bernardine, who had cooked at 3 Atlanta restaurants before moving to New Jersey, and who had volunteered for the Harrison's Table program because she believed, with the quiet certainty of a person who has fed people professionally for 20 years, that the act of cooking for someone is the closest thing to prayer that a kitchen can produce. Bernardine could have made anything. Fried chicken, gumbo, roast turkey, the full repertoire. Shaq asked for scrambled eggs and toast. "That's it?" Bernardine asked. "That's it. For the grand opening, scrambled eggs?" Shaq paused. Recalibrated. Selected which father. Chose both. My father wanted to teach me to make scrambled eggs. He said they were the first thing he ever learned to cook. He never got the chance to teach me. So yes. scrambled eggs and toast. That's the meal. Bernardine made scrambled eggs. She made them the way a chef makes scrambled eggs. Low heat, constant stirring, butter, a patience that borders on meditation, the willingness to stand at a stove for 12 minutes, doing the same small motion over and over until the curds form slowly, softly, in folds that are tender rather than rubbery, the texture of something that has been given time rather than forced into shape. She made toast, white bread, real butter, cut diagonally, because diagonal cuts are how mothers and grandmothers and diner cooks cut toast, the angle conferring no practical advantage but communicating, in the language of food presentation, that someone cared enough to make an extra cut. The food was ready at 10:45 a.m. The doors opened at 11:10. Shaq was there, standing near the table, not at the table, not sitting, not taking a seat that belonged to someone who needed it more, standing nearby, wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt and sneakers, no Tom Ford, no custom tailoring, no celebrity armor, dressed the way Philip dressed on weekends, dressed the way a man dresses when he is not performing, but simply present. Lucille was there, blue cardigan, reading glasses on the chain, sitting in a chair near the wall, not at the table, because Lucille was not someone who sat at the center of things. She sat at the edges. She watched. People came, families, individuals, couples, the population of a food bank on a Saturday morning, the cross-section of American food insecurity that includes elderly people on fixed incomes and single mothers between paychecks and recently unemployed construction workers and immigrants navigating a new country without a safety net, and veterans whose benefits don't cover everything, and college students who chose tuition over groceries, and people who look, from the outside, like they have everything together, and who are, on the inside, counting the days until the next paycheck with the same tight, airless arithmetic that Maribel Constantino Reyes used to count the months until the bills consumed her. They came to the table. Some hesitated. The table looked different from what they expected. They expected folding tables and plastic chairs and the institutional, temporary, we're doing our best aesthetic of most hunger relief spaces. They saw instead oak, 12 chairs, ceramic plates, blue napkins, scrambled eggs that smelled like butter and patience, toast cut on the diagonal. They sat down, not all at once, one by one. A woman in her 60s sat first, sat with the decisiveness of a person who has learned not to hesitate when something good is offered, because hesitation is a luxury that food-insecure people cannot afford. She sat and placed her hands on the table and felt the wood, the smooth, oiled, reclaimed church oak, and her fingers moved across the surface the way Lucille's fingers had moved across the words carved into the bottom of the footlocker, reading, feeling, receiving through touch the history embedded in the material. Others followed. A young couple with a toddler, a man in his 40s alone, wearing a jacket that was too thin for March, two teenage boys who sat next to each other and pulled out their phones and then, after a moment, put their phones away. Because something about the table, something about the plates and the napkins and the eggs that smelled like someone's kitchen, made the phones feel wrong, made the screens feel like walls, made the boys want, for reasons they couldn't articulate and didn't try to be present rather than elsewhere. And then Corbin walked in. Corbin Jeffries was 37 years old. He was an electrician, or had been, until the commercial construction project he was working on in Elizabeth stalled in September due to a financing dispute between the developer and the lender. A dispute that had nothing to do with Corbin and that affected Corbin completely. Because when construction stops, electricians stop, and when electricians stop, paychecks stop. And when paychecks stop, refrigerators empty. He had been unemployed for 4 months. His savings, modest to begin with, the savings of a man who earned $58,000 a year and spent $54,000 of it on rent and utilities and car payments and insurance, and the daily, relentless, never-ending cascade of costs that constitute middle-class life in northern New Jersey. His savings lasted 6 weeks. After that, credit cards. After the credit cards, borrowed money from his brother Randall. After Randall, the food bank. He came with his son, Theo, 6 years old, first grade. missing his 2 front teeth, the natural, on-schedule loss of baby teeth that happens at 6 and that gives children a temporary gap-toothed grin of such pure, unself-conscious joy that it functions as a kind of universal password. A face that unlocks tenderness in anyone who sees it. Theo was wearing a Spider-Man hoodie. He was holding Corbin's hand. He was looking at the table with the wide, absorptive gaze of a child encountering something new. A gaze that takes in everything without filtering, without judging, without the adult habit of comparing what is to what was expected. Corbin hesitated at the entrance. He saw the table. He saw the plates. He saw the eggs and the toast and the blue napkins. He saw the other families, already seated, already eating, already occupying the space with the settled, grateful, slightly bewildered air of people who have been given something they didn't expect. He hesitated because the table was too nice, too real, too much like a home, like the home he was supposed to provide, the home that was supposed to have a table like this. A table where he sat across from his son every evening and they ate together, and the meal was normal, was ordinary, was the kind of unremarkable daily ritual that people who have enough food don't even think about because it's always there. The way air is always there, the way the ground is always there, until it's not. He hesitated because sitting at this table meant admitting that his own table was empty. Theo pulled his hand. "Dad, there's eggs. 6-year-olds do not hesitate. 6-year-olds see eggs, and they want eggs, and the wanting is pure and immediate and uncontaminated by shame or pride, or the complex adult calculus of what it means to need. Dad, can we sit?" Corbin looked at the table, at the oak, at the blue napkins, at the empty chair, 2 empty chairs side by side waiting. He sat down. Theo sat next to him, immediately reached for the fork. Corbin gently intercepted, "Wait, buddy, let me get you a plate." He served Theo. Eggs on the plate, toast on the side, diagonal cut. The butter was melting into the bread, darkening the surface in an uneven golden pattern that looked, if you were 6 years old and had a sufficient imagination, like a map of a country where everything was warm. Theo ate. He ate with the focused, complete, full-body commitment that 6-year-olds bring to everything. Eating, playing, sleeping, crying. No half measures, no moderation. He ate the eggs with his fork in one hand, and his toast in the other, and his elbows on the table, and his feet swinging beneath the chair, because his legs weren't long enough to reach the floor, and the swinging was rhythmic, metronometric, the unconscious physical expression of a child who is content. Corbin watched him eat, and on Corbin's face, on the face of a 37-year-old electrician who had lost his job and his savings and his certainty, and who was sitting in a food bank on a Saturday morning at a table made of reclaimed church oak. On that face was an expression. Shaq saw it from across the room. He recognized it instantly. Not from a photograph, not from a description in a letter, from something deeper. From the place in his chest where Philip's letter had detonated and rearranged the furniture and created a new room. The room where Joseph Tony lived now. The room that was still under construction but that had walls and a door. And, as of this moment, a window. Through that window, Shaq could see Corbin's face. And Corbin's face was the face that Joseph Tony had imagined every night in a room above a hardware store. The face of a father sitting across from his son, watching him eat and being filled, not by the food, by the watching, by the presence, by the 3 feet of oak and air between them that constituted, in that moment, the entire distance between hunger and nourishment. The expression on Corbin's face was not happiness. It was not relief. It was not gratitude. Gratitude is what you feel when someone gives you something, and this was different, because what Corbin was receiving was not a gift. It was a restoration, a return. The return of something that should never have been taken. The right of a father to feed his child, to sit at a table, to watch his son eat eggs and toast and swing his feet and be 6 years old and content. "Sit down, son. I made this for you." The 8 words, Joseph's words. The words that were never spoken to Shaq, but that were being spoken now. Not by Joseph, not by Philip, not by anyone. By the table itself. By the oak and the joints and the oil finish that would darken with use. By the blue napkins and the diagonal toast and the scrambled eggs made with patience and butter. by the architecture of a meal served with dignity to a man who needed it. The words were being spoken by a table to a room full of people who heard them without hearing them. Sit down. I made this for you. Shaq walked to the table. He sat down. Not at the head, there was no head. The table was democratic, egalitarian, a rectangle with no hierarchy. He sat at an empty spot near the end, across from Corbin, across from Theo. Theo looked up, eggs on his chin gap, toothed grin, Spider-Man hoodie. "You're really big," Theo said. "I get that a lot," Shaq said. "Do you like eggs?" Shaq looked at the plate. At the scrambled eggs, soft, golden, made by a chef named Bernardine, who understood that cooking for someone is a form of prayer. He picked up a fork. A real fork. Heavy. "Yeah," he said. "I like eggs." He ate. Across from him, Corbin ate, and Theo ate, and the woman in her 60s ate, and the young couple with the toddler ate, and the man in the thin jacket ate, and the two teenage boys who had put their phones away ate. 12 people at a table made of church oak in a food bank in New Jersey, eating scrambled eggs and toast on a Saturday morning in March, each one carrying a hunger that the eggs could not fully satisfy, but that the table, the sitting, the proximity, the shared act of being human and hungry and fed, could begin to address. Because hunger is not solved by food alone. Hunger is solved by tables. By the decision to build a place where people sit together and eat together and are, for the duration of the meal, not alone. Not statistics, not case numbers, not food-insecure individuals in a government report, people. Fathers and sons and mothers and daughters and strangers who become, for the length of a meal, companions. Who pass the salt, who share the bread, who look across 3 feet of oak and see another human being looking back. Shaq ate the eggs. They were simple, they were good. They were the meal that Joseph Tony wanted to cook for his son. The first thing Joseph ever learned to make. The thing he wanted to teach Shaq. The thing he rehearsed in a room surrounded by unsent letters and unrealized dreams. Scrambled eggs. The simplest meal in the world. The most important meal ever served. At a table named Harrison. For both of them. The one who stayed. The one who dreamed. For every father who ever wanted to say 8 words. For every son who ever needed to hear them. "Sit down, son. I made this for you." Philip Harrison carved 3 words into the bottom of a footlocker because he couldn't say them out loud. Joseph Tony wrote 47 letters because he couldn't walk through the door. And Shaq sold everything he built because he finally understood that the biggest thing a man can do is set a table for someone who has nowhere to sit. Now tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. From Newark to Emporia to Atlanta to wherever you are sitting right now, let me know. And if this one hit different, if it made you think about your father or your son, or a meal you never got to share, or a letter you never got to send, hit that like button. Not for the algorithm, for Joseph. For the 47 letters that ended up in a landfill, because nobody knew what they were. Your like makes sure this story doesn't end up the same way. Subscribe so you never miss one of these. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Especially the fathers. Especially the ones who think they have nothing to offer. You have more than you know. Now click the video on your screen right now because the next story will break you open the same way this one did, and I promise you are not ready.